Russia built its empire on hard power, tanks, propaganda, fear. But now it's collapsing under something it never saw coming: women. In cities from Moscow to Novosibirsk, you don't hear the chants of protesters. You hear the clanging of empty pots. You don't see foreign saboteurs. You see grieving mothers, school teachers, teenage girls. And behind every widow's cry is the truth. This isn't Russia's war anymore. It's Putin's. The soldiers are dead. The men have vanished. And now the women are rising, not with guns, but with grief. And in a regime built on control and silence, their defiance is louder than any missile strike. Putin can crush opposition parties. He can jail artists and censor the web. But he can't jail every mother. He can't silence every kitchen. And that's why, as you're about to see, Russia is falling from the inside out. But you haven't seen what they're willing to do yet. Because to understand why Putin is losing this war, you first need to understand what happened to Russia's men, and the numbers are beyond shocking. In 2020, women made up about 54% of Russia's population, normal for most countries. Alcohol, disease, the usual suspects, keeping male life expectancy lower than female. But since February 2022, something unprecedented happened. According to demographic analyses from 2024, women now constitute roughly 63% of Russia's population. Let that sink in. 2/3 female. That's not a gender gap, it's a demographic catastrophe. Over 120,000 Russian men have been killed in combat since the invasion began. Hundreds of thousands more fled the country to dodge conscription. Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Turkey. They left everything behind and ran. And the ones who stayed, they're in hiding, off the grid, living in apartments without paperwork, working cash jobs, avoiding every database the state monitors. The result is entire age brackets of men simply gone, vanished into graves of exile. A 2025 analysis titled "The Ghost Demographics of Russia" laid it bare. Villages across Siberia, the Urals, and rural provinces now house only women, elderly, and children. The men disappeared. Hospitals are closing entire maternity wards. Not enough births to justify keeping them open. Town squares that once echoed with men's voices now sit silent except for the shuffling of babushkas and the cries of fatherless children. Walk through rural Buryatia or the Altai Republic and you'll see it. Shuttered shops, abandoned farms, houses with only widows inside. The demographic map of Russia is turning into a graveyard punctuated by empty cribs. The Russian population pyramid no longer looks like a pyramid. It looks like a crumbling tower, wide at the top with grandmothers and hollow where young men should be. This isn't theory. This is what happens when you wage war without end. You lose an entire generation, and when that generation is gone, the women left behind ask one simple question: why? That question is spreading like wildfire, and it's turning Putin's so-called patriots into his worst nightmare. Let's be clear, these aren't the opposition activists Putin spent years jailing. These aren't the dissidents he labeled foreign agents. These are the women who believed him, who sent their husbands and sons off to fight, who thought they were defending the motherland. And now they're standing in Pushkin Square in Moscow dressed in black, screaming at the Kremlin, "Give us back our husbands! Stop your war!" The movement calls itself Put Domoy, the way home. Hundreds of wives and mothers demanding their men return. And here's the thing that terrifies the regime. These women used to support Putin. They weren't radicals, they were believers. But after months turned to years, their pride turned to anguish, and anguish turned to rage. According to the Moscow Times, in mid-2024, the Russian government branded these mothers and wives as foreign agents, the ultimate Kremlin insult. They're not foreign agents, they're Russian mothers who lost their sons and are demanding answers. And they're asking the one question that destroys all propaganda: why did my son die while the sons of officials party on beaches in Dubai? No state TV presenter has an answer for that. Putin certainly doesn't, but it gets worse. The men who died for the motherland are now drowning in state neglect. This isn't just a failure of logistics, it's a metaphor for the entire war. The state uses you, breaks you, buries you, and then lets you sink. And while widows weep over graves, other women discovered a weapon Putin never saw coming. If you think this is just about sanctions or tanks, keep watching, because what's happening in Russia's kitchens is more dangerous than any NATO weapon. Because it's hard to jail someone for making noise in their own kitchen. From Kaliningrad in the west to Vladivostok in the east, spanning 11 time zones, you hear it, the clanging of empty pots. It's called the cacerolazo, borrowed from Latin American protesters, and Russian women have turned it into a symphony of defiance. They throw open their windows, grab cookware, and bang, metal on metal, spoons on pans, an empty pot making an unanswerable statement. We cannot feed our children. And Putin can't stop it. Police can't arrest a woman for cooking in her own home. Security services can't raid every apartment in Moscow because someone's making noise at dinner time. The sound is everywhere and nowhere, unstoppable. Why empty pots? Because food prices in Russia have skyrocketed. The Kremlin raised VAT from 20% to 22% effective January 1, 2026 to fund the war. Sanctions choked supply chains. Staples like bread, eggs, and cooking oil now cost double or triple what they did in 2021. The kitchen table economy is collapsing, and every clanging pot is a vote of no confidence. Russian history is haunting Putin right now. In 1917, female-led bread riots in Petrograd ignited the Russian Revolution. Women, not soldiers, not intellectuals, stormed the streets, demanding food and toppled the Tsar. Putin knows this history. His security services know it, and they're watching the same pattern emerge. The empty pot march isn't just protest, it's a warning. When women can't feed their families, regimes fall. But if Putin thought angry mothers banging pots were his biggest problem, he was wrong. Because to keep his war machine fed with bodies, he built something far more dystopian, a digital gulag. On October 1, 2025, Vladimir Putin signed the largest conscription decree in 9 years. 135,000 young men ordered into uniform. But this time, there's no escape. Russia rolled out a new electronic draft system. The moment a conscription notice hits your government portal account, you are legally summoned. You don't have to open it. You don't have to read it. The system registers delivery automatically, and the clock starts ticking. 7 days, that's all you get. Within 7 days of the e-summons, you must report, or else. If you don't show, your passport is flagged. You can't leave the country. Your driver's license is suspended. After 20 days, you can't take loans. You can't sell property. You become a non-person in the digital economy. Putin took almost 140 million Russians hostage with lines of code. Think about that. No checkpoints, no border guards dragging people off trains. Just an algorithm that turns you into a ghost in your own country. Men across Russia panicked. Flights to Armenia, Turkey, and Central Asia sold out within hours. Airport security began profiling young men, pulling them aside, checking draft status on government databases right there at the gate. Those who could afford it fled immediately. Those who couldn't went underground, deleting social media, avoiding hospitals, working off the books. Some men stopped using their phones entirely, knowing every ping could give away their location. Others moved constantly, couch surfing, never staying in one place long enough to be found. The digital surveillance state forced an entire generation into the shadows. One father in St. Petersburg said it best. "We are all prisoners now. Any day a message may come saying I belong to the army." This is Putin's Russia in 2025. A giant open-air prison where the walls are invisible but absolute, where every click, every login, every transaction could trigger the trap. And while Putin builds his digital walls, inside those walls, something unexpected is happening. Resistance. Quiet. Creative. Unstoppable. Meet Alexandra Skotchelenko. In March 2022, horrified by the bombing of Ukrainian cities, Sasha did something small. She walked into a supermarket in St. Petersburg and replaced a few price tags with handwritten notes. Instead of barcodes, shoppers found messages. The Russian army bombed an art school in Mariupol. Around 400 people were hiding inside. That's it, 5 pieces of paper, tiny, harmless. For that, Sasha was arrested, denied medical care in jail, and sentenced to 7 years in prison. 7 years for 5 price tags. In court, she said something that will echo through Russian history. How fragile must the prosecutor's belief in our state be if he thinks that our statehood and public safety can be brought down by 5 small pieces of paper? But here's what the Kremlin doesn't understand. Arresting Sasha didn't silence dissent. It inspired thousands. Now, women across Russia are waging a guerrilla war of symbols. They wear earrings shaped like peace doves, subtle anti-war markers that aren't illegal yet. University students swap QR codes on propaganda posters with links to casualty lists. Anonymous hands scrawl "No to War" in public bathrooms. Banknotes circulate stamped with anti-war slogans. Police have detained women for wearing green ribbons, a color some adopted for peace. One woman in Moscow was questioned for having blue and yellow nail polish, Ukraine's flag colors. The paranoia runs deep, but the most dangerous resistance? It's happening inside the system itself. Doctors and nurses are signing open letters against the war, risking their careers. Draft officers sympathetic to families lose mobilization files. Paperwork for conscription mysteriously disappears or gets delayed. Teachers take maximum sick leave. Clerks process penalties at a snail's pace. One movement member described it perfectly. These steps are draining officials' resources and showing that not everything is okay. This is a bureaucratic sabotage, a silent strike no one can prove, but everyone can feel. Putin can issue mobilization orders, but if the documents vanish in a basement in Omsk, the soldier never reaches the front. It's sand in the gears of the war machine, tiny, impossible to crush, everywhere. And while the bureaucracy jams, the economy is grinding to a halt. Because here's where Putin's problems go from political to existential. In December 2025, workers at the Volkovsko mine, one of Russia's largest iron ore deposits in the Ural Mountains, recorded a desperate video. Hundreds of miners, unpaid for months, stranded at remote work camps with no way home. A miner's wife, backed by grimy, exhausted men, shouted into the camera, "No tickets are being purchased for us to leave the site. Travel expenses are not reimbursed. Daily food allowances are not paid. And compensation for delayed wages is not paid." The camera shakes. You can hear the anger, the desperation. These aren't protesters. They're workers who believed in the system, who did backbreaking labor in freezing conditions, who expected the state to honor its promises. These are the heroes of Soviet propaganda, the men who extract Russia's industrial might from the earth, the workers whose strength built empires, and now they're begging on camera, denouncing the government that abandoned them. This should terrify Putin, because in 1989, coal miners' strikes in these same regions signaled the unraveling of Soviet power. When the mines go silent, when the men who dig Russia's wealth turn against Moscow, that's when empires fall. History is repeating. And it's not just Volkovsko. According to Reuters, in late 2025, at least 6 major Russian companies moved to 4-day work weeks to cut costs. Avtovaz, Russia's largest car maker, slashed hours because unsold inventory is piling up. Russian Railways, the country's biggest employer, is forcing workers to take unpaid leave. Even Ural-Vagonzavod, the defense contractor that makes tanks, had to trim hours for civilian employees. Official unemployment looks low on paper, but only because companies avoid formal layoffs. Instead, they cut hours, slash wages, leave workers in limbo. Meanwhile, inflation is crushing households. The VAT hike made everything more expensive overnight. Food, fuel, medicine. Families are drowning. According to official Russian data, overdue wage arrears more than tripled between 2024 and 2025. Non-military sectors of the economy shrank over 5%. The war economy Putin brags about? It's cannibalizing the civilian economy. And here's the dangerous part. This creates the triangle of anger that topples regimes. The soldier in the trench is angry because he has no ammunition, no boots, no rations. The factory worker is angry because his paycheck is halved or gone. The mother at home is angry because the pot is empty and prices have doubled. When these three types of anger meet, revolutions happen. Putin knows this. His security services know this. They're panicking, and their desperation shows in what they're doing to the poorest regions. In Buryatia, one of Russia's poorest, most remote republics, Volunteer went door to door in mid-2025 with an unusual request. They asked residents to donate refrigerators, not money, household fridges, for the army to store medicines at field hospitals on the front. They also asked for motorcycles, wheelchairs, canes, and bottled water. Think about the humiliation. The second most powerful military in the world, according to Putin, is begging its poorest citizens for used appliances. In Irkutsk, another Siberian region, teachers' annual bonuses were cut to fund the war. They told us there's no money left for the special military operation, so they took ours, one teacher said bitterly. This is state banditry. In Moscow, at the prestigious Bauman Moscow State Technical University, students are offered physical education credits in exchange for knitting camouflage nets for soldiers. Future engineers and scientists hunched over yarn instead of textbooks. The education system militarized. Innovation sacrificed for war. But here's the part that makes Russians truly angry. Charitable donations to the army quadrupled in 2025. That sounds patriotic, right? Until you dig deeper. Families aren't donating because they support the war. They're donating because the army isn't feeding their sons. Parents send food, warm clothes, first aid kits, even night vision goggles, because horror stories abound of soldiers going into combat unprepared. These donations aren't charity, they're ransom. Families paying to keep their relatives alive because the state abandoned them. And investigations by independent outlets found that much of the aid never reaches the front. Corrupt middlemen skim it off. So families sacrifice their savings, and their sons still freeze in trenches. This exploitation is particularly cruel in Russia's ethnic minority regions. Buryatia, Tuva, Dagestan, Chechnya. These republics have seen far higher per capita casualties than Moscow or St. Petersburg. Their young men were lured by military contracts as a rare path out of poverty, and now they're dying at rates that dwarf the capital. Moscow not only drafts their sons, it also passes around the collection plate for a war these regions never wanted. This is sparking dangerous embers of separatism. In Dagestan, village elders have reportedly discussed resisting further mobilization and even local self-rule if Moscow keeps bleeding them dry. In Tatarstan, an imam said in a sermon, "It's not justice for the capital to start a war and send the bill to our villages." He's now under investigation for extremism, but his words resonated. If the federal center gives nothing but death and taxes, why should the regions obey? These are questions Putin cannot afford people to ask. And while officials scramble to suppress dissent, Putin's own secret polls tell a story he desperately wants hidden. According to a leaked Kremlin Commission survey reported in late 2025, over 83% of Russians are tired of the war, more than 8 in 10, and support for continuing the fighting? Under 20%. Let that land. Putin's own government knows the public has turned. Independent pollsters at the Levada Center found that 55% of Russians now say they don't want a male relative to join the war. Only 30% support it. And 61% say peace negotiations should begin immediately. The myth of national unity is dead. The war that was supposed to unite Russia has fundamentally alienated it. This isn't Russia's war anymore, it's Putin's, and the people want it to stop. Even state TV can't hide it. Putin's recent appearances show a man increasingly disconnected. He rants about historical destiny and external enemies, while ordinary Russians worry about whether they can afford sugar. The strongman image, carefully cultivated for over 20 years, is cracking. Putin looks like an isolated czar in a bunker, detached from the grim reality his people face daily. Security services are on high alert. They're terrified the fragmented protests, a rally here over prices, a march there by mothers, a strike at a mine could merge into something nationwide. Because Russia's been here before. In 1905, a disastrous war against Japan and rising prices led to the first mass revolt against the Tsar. In 1917, war weariness and female-led bread riots toppled an empire. In 1991, a failing war in Afghanistan and economic collapse hastened the Soviet Union's end. Now consider Putin's situation: a long, stalemated foreign war, mounting military casualties, an economy in quiet crisis, and courageous women lighting the spark of protest. This is the same toxic combination that has ended Russian regimes before. And at the center of this perfect storm are Russia's women. They have emerged as the conscience of the nation. They ask the questions no one on state TV dares. What are we fighting for? Where are our husbands? Why are our children hungry? Is this Putin's war or Russia's war? The answer they give increasingly is that it is Putin's alone, and they refuse to sacrifice any more for it. Here's what makes this movement so dangerous for the Kremlin. They can't discredit these women. Putin's propaganda machine usually dismisses protesters as paid Western agents or dangerous radicals. But when a 40-year-old mother stands in Red Square holding a photo of her dead son in uniform, calling for peace, she doesn't fit that narrative. These women are often apolitical. Many were pro-Putin until their sons died. They speak from the highest moral ground, protecting family, the sanctity of life. Arresting them only shatters the regime's legitimacy further. It's one thing to jail opposition politicians, it's another to silence a grieving mother. As winter sets in, Russia stands at a crossroads. Putin remains in power for now. There's no unified opposition movement, but the foundations of his rule are eroding from every angle. The fortress Russia he tried to build is being eaten from inside. The economy is weakening behind high walls of sanctions. The populace inside the fortress is restive and disenchanted, and the supposed unity of purpose has been fractured by hunger and sorrow. Every night, across 11 time zones, the sound of empty pots carries a revolutionary lullaby. In countless kitchens, whispers of truth spread about the latest conscript killed, the neighbor's son who fled, the factory cutting hours, the ruble's value sliding, how things weren't supposed to be like this. Kitchen table talk is the bane of dictators. It's how revolutions incubate, where open speech is risky. No one can say for certain what happens next. Perhaps the state will suppress dissent through fear a while longer. Perhaps the war will somehow end and pressures will ease. But one thing is undeniable: Russia's social contract is broken. The people were willing to endure hardship for a quick, victorious campaign, not for a quagmire that brings only grief and poverty. The women of Russia, once seen as politically passive, have found their voice, and it carries the weight of moral authority. Their message is shaking the pillars of Kremlin power more effectively than any foreign sanction or opposition politician ever could. They have called Putin's bluff. He can jail activists and censor the internet, but he cannot jail every mother. He cannot censor every empty stomach. Putin opened battle on the one front he cannot win, the home front. He prepared for every external enemy, but not for the implosion of support from within. The soft power of women's tears and the hard reality of economic pain have converged. It's a slow, quiet rebellion, but it's irrepressible. The country is falling, not to a foreign invader, but to the accumulated weight of its own unsustainable burdens. The tanks may still roll, the propaganda may still blare, but beneath it all, Russia is hollowing out. And if salvation comes, it may well be the daughters of Mother Russia who carry the day, turning their nation back from a path of self-destruction. The women didn't ask for this war. They didn't vote for endless conscription. They didn't choose to become widows and orphans. But they're the ones left standing when the men are gone. They're the ones who have to bury the dead, raise the children alone, and find a way forward when the state offers nothing but more sacrifice. Putin faces a choice: heed the cry of his women and change course, or continue down a road that could lead to the fall of yet another Russian regime. The final chapters of this saga haven't been written, but the verdict of history is often kind to truth-tellers and harsh to those who ignore them. Today, the truth is being spoken in a mother's trembling voice on the streets of Moscow, and it's a voice that will not be silenced. What do you think? Can Putin survive the mother's rebellion? Or is this how empires actually end? Not with missiles and tanks, but with empty pots and grieving mothers? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to Fall of Nations, because we cover the collapse no one else will show you.
Putin promised Russian mothers their sons would only fight for a few weeks, a quick special military operation to liberate Ukraine. Instead, he's fed over 1 million Russian soldiers into a meat grinder that shows no signs of stopping. And now, Russians are finally fighting back. Not against Ukraine, against Putin himself. Soldiers are refusing orders and surrendering en masse. Military wives are staging protests outside the defense ministry. Even Putin's own mercenaries have marched on Moscow with guns drawn. The rebellion is spreading faster than Putin can contain it. About 64% of Russians now want peace talks immediately, the highest number since the war began. Soldiers are shooting themselves in the legs to escape the front lines. Entire units are deserting rather than face Ukrainian forces. And here's the thing Putin never saw coming. This isn't about politics or ideology. It's about survival. Russian mothers are done watching their sons come home in body bags for a war that makes no sense. Russian wives are done being widows for Putin's ego. Russian soldiers are done dying for a cause they don't believe in. What you're about to witness is the story of how Putin's war is destroying Putin's Russia from within. Because when you send 1 million men to die for nothing, eventually even Russians say enough is enough. Let's break down exactly how Putin's glorious war turned into the biggest military disaster in Russian history since World War II. 1 million casualties. Let that sink in for a moment. According to Western intelligence estimates and independent Russian sources, Putin has managed to kill or wound over 1 million Russian soldiers in just 3.5 years of fighting. That's roughly 250,000 dead and 750,000 wounded. Numbers so catastrophic they dwarf every Soviet and Russian conflict combined since 1945. To put this butchery in perspective, Russia has lost 5 times more soldiers in Ukraine than in all Russian and Soviet wars combined between World War II and 2022. The decade-long Soviet war in Afghanistan? About 15,000 dead. The brutal Chechen wars? Some 25,000 in total. Putin managed to exceed all of that in his first 6 months alone. But here's what makes these numbers even more shocking. Putin is achieving virtually nothing with this massive sacrifice of human life. Since January 2024, Russian forces have been advancing at an average rate of just 50 meters per day in some sectors. That's slower than the British and French advance during the World War I Battle of the Somme, one of history's most notorious examples of pointless slaughter. Think about that. Putin's modern army, with all its supposed technological advantages, is moving slower than soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles and bayonets over a century ago. And the cost? According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russia has seized less than 1% of Ukrainian territory since January 2024. They've traded 1 million casualties for roughly 5,000 square kilometers, an area slightly bigger than the state of Delaware. NATO officials report that Russia was losing approximately 1,200 soldiers killed or wounded every single day during May and June 2024. By November, that number had climbed to 1,500 daily casualties. On the bloodiest day in November 2024, Russia lost 1,950 men, more than the average daily birth rate of Russian males. Let me repeat that. Putin was killing more Russian men per day than Russia was producing. But wait. You haven't heard the most damning part yet. Remember March 2022, just weeks after the invasion began? Putin stood before television cameras and made a solemn promise to Russian mothers. No conscripts will be sent to Ukraine. Only professional contract soldiers would fight his war, he assured them. That promise lasted exactly as long as Putin's prediction of a quick victory. By summer 2022, raw 18 and 19-year-old conscripts were being coerced into signing military contracts and shipped straight to the Ukrainian front lines. These weren't hardened professional soldiers. They were teenagers who had been drafted for mandatory military service and suddenly found themselves facing Ukrainian artillery. The stories that emerged were heartbreaking. Young men calling their mothers from trenches, begging for help. Families discovering their conscript sons had been declared volunteers and sent into combat with just days of training. One mother told Russian media in late 2023, "We are horrified because we don't want to fight. They're just kids." Another wrote, "Why are conscripts being deployed for the special operation? It's the state's duty to bring them home alive and well." But Putin's war machine was hungry for fresh meat, and it didn't care about the age of the soldiers feeding it. In 2024, independent Russian outlet Mediazona documented that Russian military courts had prosecuted over 10,000 cases of soldiers refusing to serve, nearly double the number from the previous year. And that's just the ones who got caught and prosecuted. The real number of soldiers saying no to Putin's war is likely 10 times higher. Because here's what Putin never expected. When you ask people to die for nothing, eventually they stop volunteering. But the most shocking rebellion wasn't happening in the courtrooms or the barracks. It was happening on the battlefield itself. Meet Ukraine's I Want to Live hotline, probably the most successful Ukrainian weapon in the entire war. This simple phone number and website, designed to help Russian soldiers surrender safely, has become Putin's worst nightmare. By early 2024, over 26,000 Russian soldiers had contacted the hotline looking for a way out of Putin's meat grinder. The website had been visited tens of millions of times, with the vast majority of those hits coming from inside Russia itself. Think about what that means. Russian soldiers, sitting in their barracks or trenches, were secretly researching how to surrender to the enemy rather than fight for their own country. And they weren't just thinking about it, they were doing it in record numbers. In August 2024, over 100 Russian troops surrendered simultaneously during a single Ukrainian operation in Kursk, one of the largest mass surrenders of the entire war. Ukrainian forces reported that the Russian soldiers simply dropped their weapons and walked toward Ukrainian positions with white flags. Their commanders had fled, leaving them to face Ukrainian forces alone. But mass surrenders are just part of their story. Russian soldiers have gotten creative about avoiding Putin's war. In 2023 and 2024, dozens of Russian paratroopers deliberately shot each other in the legs and arms to earn medical evacuations. They'd rather face friendly fire than Ukrainian fire. Others simply vanished. According to Russian military records, nearly 16,000 criminal cases for crimes against military service, including going AWOL, have been opened against Russian troops since the invasion began. Last year, a record of 20,040 petitions were filed to declare soldiers missing or dead. And in July 2024 alone, Russian military courts processed over 1,000 new desertion cases in a single month. The Russian military response has been predictably brutal. Deserters face up to 10 years in prison. Some units have started tying suspected deserters to trees and leaving them for Ukrainian drones to find, a practice captured on multiple videos circulating on social media. But even the threat of execution isn't stopping the exodus. Why? Because Russian soldiers have figured out something Putin refuses to admit. This war is unwinnable, and they're tired of dying for his delusions. One Russian serviceman summed it up perfectly. "I don't want to die here. It's not my war. It's not our war. I don't understand what the hell we are doing here." That sentiment is spreading through Russian ranks like wildfire, and it's not just the soldiers who are fed up. June 3rd, 2024, outside the Russian Defense Ministry in Moscow. A scene that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. About 20 Russian women kneel on the sidewalk, holding handwritten signs, "Bring my mobilized husband home. Enough of this war." Some have brought their children, toddlers holding signs that read, "Please bring Papa home." These weren't professional protesters or opposition activists. These were ordinary Russian wives and mothers, the same women Putin had counted on to support his war. And they were publicly demanding an end to the slaughter. The protest was organized by a grassroots movement called Putin Domoy, the Way Home. Their Telegraph channel has over 37,000 followers, mostly women whose husbands, sons, and brothers were swept up in Putin's September 2022 mobilization and never allowed to return home. The irony was devastating. Putin had declared 2024 the year of the family in Russia. Yet here were Russian families begging him to return their fathers and husbands from his war. One woman, identified as Paulina, captured the bitter absurdity. "Why is it the year of the family and I don't have a husband? It's like mockery or taunting." Maria Andreeva, one of the movement's leaders, walked straight into Putin's Moscow election headquarters in January 2024 and confronted campaign workers. "I'm interested to know when he will issue a decree that my husband has to be home," she demanded. When a campaign worker suggested she pray, Andreeva shot back, "What will I get back? A man without legs, without arms, a sick man?" These women represent something Putin fears more than Ukrainian missiles: the collapse of domestic support for his war. Russian polling shows that about half of respondents support the women's demands for the immediate return of mobilized soldiers. Among Russians aged 18 to 29, support rises to 69%. Even more damaging for Putin, about 60% of Russians oppose a second mobilization. He's running out of people willing to die for his cause. The Kremlin's response has been typically heavy-handed. In May 2024, the Russian Justice Ministry declared the Way Home movement a foreign agent, a label designed to criminalize their activities. They've started detaining journalists who cover the protests. But you can't arrest grief. You can't jail desperation. And you can't silence the growing chorus of Russian voices demanding an end to Putin's war. Because these women have something Putin's propaganda machine can't counter: moral authority. They're not Western-funded dissidents or liberal opposition figures. They're the mothers and wives of the very soldiers Putin claims to be fighting for. And they're calling his war exactly what it is: a pointless slaughter of their loved ones. But the rebellion against Putin goes deeper than battlefield desertions and family protests. It reaches into the very heart of Putin's power structure, and the results have been explosive. June 24th, 2023, a date that will haunt Putin for the rest of his rule. That's when Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's former chef turned mercenary boss, did something unprecedented in Putin's 26-year reign. He launched an armed rebellion against the Russian state. Prigozhin's Wagner mercenaries seized the city of Rostov-on-Don, a major military headquarters, then began marching toward Moscow. For about 24 hours, Russia teetered on the brink of civil war as thousands of heavily armed mercenaries drove unopposed toward the capital. Putin's response revealed just how weak his grip on power has become. Instead of crushing the rebellion with overwhelming force, he cut a deal. Prigozhin called off his March of Justice in exchange for safe passage to Belarus. The message was clear: even Putin's most brutal enforcers were turning against him. But Prigozhin wasn't just rebelling. He was exposing the rot at the heart of Putin's war machine. In scathing videos posted before his revolt, he accused Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and the military leadership of incompetence, corruption, and lying about the war's progress. Most damaging of all, Prigozhin directly challenged the official justifications for the invasion. The war wasn't for demilitarizing or denazifying Ukraine, he declared. It was driven by the personal ambitions of the army leadership. 2 months later, Prigozhin died in a mysterious plane crash. But his rebellion had already shattered Putin's aura of invincibility. For the first time in his rule, Putin had been forced to negotiate with a mutineer. And Prigozhin wasn't the only insider turning against the war. Igor Girkin, a former FSB officer and key architect of Russia's 2014 intervention in Ukraine, became one of Putin's harshest critics. Despite being a hardline nationalist who wanted Russia to defeat Ukraine, Girkin was so disgusted with Putin's war leadership that he began publicly attacking the president. In 2023, Girkin called Putin a cowardly mediocrity and non-entity. He accused Defense Minister Shoigu of incompetence and urged Putin to step aside. This wasn't some liberal opposition figure. This was a man who had helped start Russia's war in Donbass. The Kremlin's response was swift. Girkin was arrested and sentenced to 4 years in prison. But the damage was done. Even Putin's most loyal supporters were publicly questioning his competence. Throughout 2023 and 2024, reports emerged of purges within the Russian military. Generals were fired, demoted, or mysteriously disappeared after criticizing the conduct of the war. In one documented case, General Ivan Popov was reportedly dismissed for complaining that his troops were taking heavy casualties due to lack of support from higher command. The paranoia reached all the way to the top. Putin has concentrated so much power in his own hands that even routine military decisions now require his personal approval. Local officials, terrified of making mistakes, have stopped making decisions altogether. This isn't just political infighting, it's the systematic breakdown of Russia's governing system under the pressure of an unwinnable war. But perhaps the most telling sign of Putin's growing isolation is this: he can no longer hide the scale of his failure from his own people. While Putin's propaganda machine churns out stories about a booming war economy, the reality behind the statistics tells a very different story. Russia is now spending nearly 40% of its federal budget on defense and security, a level of militarization that would make Stalin blush. To put that in perspective, the United States spends about 15% of its budget on defense, and that's considered high by Western standards. But here's the kicker: all that military spending isn't making Russia stronger. It's making it weaker. Putin has essentially turned Russia into a massive military factory, but one that produces nothing but destruction. Russian factories work around the clock manufacturing artillery shells and missiles that get fired into Ukrainian fields. Russian workers build tanks that Ukrainian drones turn into scrap metal within weeks. It's economic suicide disguised as patriotic duty. The human cost is staggering too. Russia faces a labor shortage of 2.6 million people as of the end of 2024, according to Ukrainian intelligence estimates. Young men who should be building Russia's future are either dead in Ukrainian trenches, hiding in basements to avoid conscription, or fled to neighboring countries. Putin's solution? Force undocumented migrants to join the military in exchange for legal status. He's literally recruiting foreigners to die for a war most Russians no longer support. Meanwhile, inflation is crushing ordinary Russian families. Interest rates have been hiked to devastating levels to prevent economic collapse. Non-military businesses are struggling to survive as the state diverts resources to weapons production. Putin promised Russians prosperity through military strength. Instead, he's delivered an economy that only works if it keeps feeding young men into his war machine. And Russians are starting to realize they're not customers in Putin's economy. They're the product being sold. Here's a number that should terrify Putin. 64% of Russians now support starting peace negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. That's according to polling conducted in June 2025, the highest level of support for ending the conflict since the invasion began. Think about what that means in Putin's authoritarian Russia, where criticizing the war can land you in prison. Despite years of non-stop propaganda, despite the threat of arrest, despite the complete control of state media, nearly 2/3 of Russians want this war to end. The shift in public opinion has been dramatic. In early 2022, Putin enjoyed broad support for his special military operation. Russians believed his promises of a quick victory and minimal casualties. They trusted his assurances that Ukraine would welcome Russian soldiers as liberators. More than 3 years later, those illusions have crumbled. Russian cemeteries are filling with fresh graves, while rural regions are being drained of working-age men. In some of Russia's ethnic minority regions, the impact has been devastating. The predominantly Muslim republics of Dagestan and Chechnya, along with the Buddhist majority Republic of Tuva, have lost thousands of their young men to Putin's war. Resentment is reportedly simmering as families realize their sons are being used as cannon fodder for Moscow's imperial ambitions. Since Putin's mobilization decree in September 2022, hundreds of thousands of Russian men have fled the country to avoid being drafted. Georgia, Kazakhstan, and other neighboring countries reported massive influxes of Russian refugees, men who would rather abandon their homeland than fight for Putin. One Russian man who escaped to Georgia summed up the sentiment: "I'm not going to die in someone else's insane war. This is not our war." That sentiment is spreading across generations. The economic toll is becoming impossible to ignore as well. Despite Putin's claims of a war economy boom, the reality on the ground tells a different story. Military families are struggling with inflation and shortages. Local governments can't provide basic services because their budgets have been drained by war spending. By 2024, Russia was spending nearly 40% of its federal budget on defense and security, an unsustainable level that's crowding out investment in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. But perhaps most damaging of all is the generational divide that's opening up in Russian society. Young Russians who have grown up with internet access and global connections increasingly reject Putin's imperial nostalgia. They see the war as a pointless waste of their future, and they're voting with their feet by leaving the country in record numbers. Putin's war was supposed to unite Russia behind a common cause. Instead, it's dividing Russian society more deeply than any event since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that division is about to tear his regime apart. Here's the brutal truth Putin doesn't want to face. His war in Ukraine isn't just failing on the battlefield, it's destroying Russia from within. Every day this war continues, more Russian families turn against him. Every week brings new videos of soldiers refusing to fight. Every month sees fresh protests from wives demanding their husbands' return. Putin launched this invasion believing Russians would rally behind him, the way they did after he annexed Crimea in 2014. He thought a quick victory would cement his legacy as the leader who restored Russian greatness. Instead, he's created the very thing he feared most: mass opposition to his rule from ordinary Russians who are tired of sacrificing their lives for his delusions. The numbers don't lie. More than 1 million casualties, 64% support peace talks, record levels of desertion and draft avoidance, mass immigration by young Russians, growing protests by military families. This isn't just war weariness. This is the systematic collapse of public support for Putin's most important policy. And here's what makes it so dangerous for Putin. Unlike previous Russian protests, this rebellion cuts across all of Russian society. It includes soldiers who were supposed to be his most loyal supporters. It includes military families who were supposed to be proud of their sacrifice. It includes regional officials who were supposed to implement his policies without question. When your own soldiers refuse to fight, when military mothers call you a liar, when your closest allies launch armed rebellions, you're not dealing with foreign enemies anymore. You're dealing with the collapse of your own legitimacy. Putin can arrest protesters, he can censor the media, he can threaten his critics with prison or worse. But he can't arrest grief. He can't censor death. And he can't threaten a mother's love for her son. The rebellion against Putin's war started in the trenches of Ukraine, but it's spreading to every corner of Russian society. And once people stop fearing their government, once they start demanding accountability from their leaders, once they realize they have the power to say no, that's when real change becomes inevitable. Putin promised Russians a quick victory and a return to greatness. Instead, he gave them the deadliest war in Russian history and a future filled with grief. The question isn't whether Russians will continue to rebel against Putin's war. The question is how long Putin can survive the rebellion he created. So what do you think? Are we witnessing the beginning of the end for Putin's regime, or will he find new ways to force Russians to die for his imperial ambitions? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Fall of Nations for more deep dives into the stories that are reshaping our world.
The emergency call came in at 4:55 a.m. Neighbors in Kemerovo screaming in their building. Someone was getting hurt in one of the apartments. They could hear a woman screaming through the door, describing it as a slaughterhouse. They dialed 112. No answer. Called again. Still nothing. For 3 hours, these Russian citizens called for help. 3 hours of terror. 3 hours of waiting for police who would never come. By the time officers finally arrived, it was too late. Another statistic in Russia's collapsing law and order. But here's the thing that should terrify you. This isn't happening in some war-torn region. This is happening across Russia right now. As of early 2025, Russia is bleeding police officers, 172,000 unfilled positions nationwide, a devastating 33,000 jump from the previous year. In some regions, that translates to up to 75% of jobs vacant, leaving vast areas effectively unguarded. And what's filling the void? Armed vigilante groups, ex-convicts, combat-shattered veterans who've learned that violence solves problems. We're watching a nuclear superpower disintegrate from within, and what comes next will shock you. Let's start with the numbers that should make Putin lose sleep at night. Interior Minister Vladimir Kolokotsev can no longer hide the scale of this crisis. In March 2025, he revealed the country now has 172,000 unfilled police positions, a staggering increase of 33,000 vacancies in just 1 year. Entire regions are operating with skeleton crews. Some provinces function with just 2/3 of their required officers. Think about that for a second. That's not just a shortage, that's the systematic breakdown of basic government function. But here's what's really driving this collapse. The war in Ukraine has turned into a police recruitment black hole. See, the types of people motivated to do police work are often the same people drawn to military service. And right now, Russian soldiers can earn several times what a police officer makes. A patrol officer in the provinces earns as little as 25,000 rubles per month. That's about $270. Meanwhile, combat soldiers are pulling in massive signing bonuses and war pay. But it's not just about money. There's something even more insidious happening here. The Russian government has created quotas for Interior Ministry staff to send men to the front lines. Police agencies are literally required to contribute recruits to the war effort. Some officers are being offered cash bonuses, up to 100,000 rubles, for persuading criminal detainees to enlist for Ukraine. Think about that for a moment. Police officers in St. Petersburg can double their monthly salary by sending just 2 detainees per month to war. This creates a perverse incentive where some cops focus more on funneling suspects to the military than actually fighting crime. One suspect in Voronezh alleged that police beat and electrocuted him to force him to sign a military contract. When officers were eventually arrested for this abuse, it revealed just how desperate the system has become. So thousands of officers are literally walking off the job to go fight in Ukraine. They're trading their badges for rifles because the math is simple. Why risk your life for peanuts when you can risk it for real money? Others stay in police work only to avoid conscription, since police are exempt from the draft. But even that incentive hasn't stopped the massive outflow of personnel. And those who stay behind, they're drowning. With massive vacancies, the remaining officers are working 16-hour shifts. They're covering multiple precincts. Some district officers who should be responsible for one area are now handling 4 precincts. That's about 160 people under active supervision. One officer in the Kaluga region told reporters that he's supposed to visit these people twice a month. With his impossible workload, he admits he hasn't seen some of them even once. But here's what makes this situation even more desperate. The quality of remaining officers is plummeting. As many as 40% of resigning officers now leave before retirement age. These aren't rookies washing out. These are experienced veterans with decades of knowledge walking away from their careers. In 2024, half of all officers with 10 years of experience quit their jobs. One precinct in Yekaterinburg saw nearly 100% staff turnover in just 6 years. What's left behind are either young, inexperienced recruits who have no idea what they're doing or empty desks. The system is breaking down so badly that officers are buying their own office supplies, fuel, and equipment just to do their jobs. A throwback to the chaotic 1990s that Russians thought they'd left behind forever. But the real horror story? Citizens are discovering that calling the police has become a gamble with their lives. What happens when a country's law enforcement system collapses? We're finding out in real time, and it's terrifying. Russia's Interior Ministry is now forecasting the highest spike in violent crime in 15 years. In 2024, serious and especially serious crimes reached 617,301, the highest figure in over 14 years according to ministry data. Recent statistics from the Ministry of Internal Affairs showed that between January and June 2025, 333,251 serious and particularly serious crimes were documented, a 10.4% rise compared to the same period in 2024. This means that the number of serious crimes in Russia has already reached a 15-year high by mid-2025. But here's what should terrify every Russian citizen. This isn't just about statistics. It's about the complete breakdown of the rule of law. In many Russian towns, calling the police has become an exercise in futility. Emergency response times have stretched from minutes to hours, if responses come at all. And we're not talking about minor crimes here. We're talking about life or death situations where citizens are literally fighting for survival while waiting for help that may never arrive. But statistics don't capture the human cost of this breakdown. Take what happened in the Kemerovo region, when the shortage was far less severe than today. 7 emergency calls about a violent assault. No officers for over 3 hours. Neighbors broke down the door themselves to find 23-year-old Vera Pektileva murdered by her ex-boyfriend. Today, with forces decimated, such tragedies aren't exceptional, they're routine. Across Russia, emergency calls go unanswered. Rural districts operate without protection. One Siberian detective handling dozens of cases alone admits marking most as not possible to investigate. This creates a predatory environment that feeds on itself. When criminals realize there's little chance of being caught or punished, they get bolder. They start telling their friends. Those friends commit crimes they know they can get away with. They push the envelope, escalating from petty theft to violent crime, testing how far they can go before anyone stops them. But in today's Russia, that intervention increasingly never comes. Here's how bad it's gotten. In some regions, police forces are now refusing to open new criminal cases even after crimes are reported. Officers are so overwhelmed they're essentially triaging which crimes deserve attention and which ones to ignore completely. A BBC investigation found that in many areas, if you're the victim of robbery, burglary, or assault, police will essentially tell you to handle it yourself. They don't have the manpower to investigate, the resources to pursue leads, or the time to build cases. This has created entire neighborhoods where criminals operate with complete impunity. They know the odds of facing consequences are virtually zero. And in some truly dystopian developments, desperate police departments have resorted to falsifying evidence and coercing confessions just to close cases quickly. Veteran officers describing beaten suspects so they take the blame, not because they're guilty, but because closing files is the only way to manage impossible caseloads. This means innocent people are being framed for crimes they didn't commit, while the real criminals remain free to strike again. It's a complete breakdown of justice that undermines any remaining public trust in the system. And the criminals aren't just getting bolder, they're getting deadlier. Many aren't ordinary thugs at all. They're combat veterans, battle-scarred, psychologically shattered, and legally pardoned for past crimes if they fought in Ukraine. Since the war began, over 750 civilians have been killed or seriously injured by returning servicemen, former soldiers now turned predators. As of February 2025, 378 people died in veteran-related incidents. This isn't rehabilitation, it's the weaponization of society's most dangerous elements. The Russian government's response to this crisis? They've essentially given up on traditional policing and handed the streets over to vigilantes. Meet the shadow enforcers of Putin's crumbling state. Ruskaya Obchina, the Russian community. Black-clad paramilitaries with warrior emblems and a mandate to operate beyond legal constraints. They're Russia's largest far-right organization, 1.2 million YouTube subscribers, 650,000 Telegram followers, 140 chapters spanning 11 time zones. Their innovation? A mobile app where citizens summon armed vigilantes instead of dialing police. Hit the SOS button, and masked enforcers appear to deliver their version of justice. This isn't dystopian fiction, it's Putin's Russia in 2025. In Novosibirsk, these militants rounded up construction workers and force-marched them to police stations. In St. Petersburg, they raided an apartment where a fire broke out and killed the suspect. In remote forest, they tortured a teenager with electric shock devices while threatening rape and murder. The Russian government's response? Open collaboration. Police across multiple regions openly welcome vigilante assistance due to critical understaffing. When officers arrive at scenes involving Ruskaya Obchina, the paramilitaries control the narrative while victims remain silent from fear. But here's what makes this collaboration even more disturbing. It's not just happening in remote areas. This is occurring in major cities in broad daylight with full knowledge of local authorities. These groups regularly accompany official raids, providing muscle during operations against migrant communities. They conduct warrantless searches, detain people without legal authority, and interrogate suspects using methods that would be illegal if employed by actual police. But when they occasionally face arrest, high-ranking officials intervene. After St. Petersburg police detained vigilantes for attacking taxi drivers, Alexander Bystrykin, head of Russia's investigative committee, opened cases against the arresting officers for exceeding authority. This sends an unmistakable message. These groups enjoy protection from the highest levels of power. What's even more chilling is how organized and sophisticated these groups have become. They operate training camps where they teach building assault tactics with firearms. They run cyber troops that scour the internet for content they deem unpatriotic or unorthodox, filing mass complaints to shut down everything from comic books to music festivals. They've even established funding networks that raise money for the Russian army in Ukraine, giving them political cover while they operate their parallel enforcement system. But Russkaya Obshchina represents more than street patrols. They're building a parallel enforcement system that could outlast the current regime. Here's where the nightmare truly begins. For 3 years, Russia has recruited prisoners to fight in Ukraine. Murderers, rapists, violent predators promise freedom in exchange for combat service. These men are now returning home, legally pardoned, combat-trained, psychologically destroyed. Over 1,130 veterans now face new criminal charges. The real scope is far from terrifying. Among documented cases, 166 involved outright murders that claimed 196 lives. Another 112 deaths resulted from grievous bodily harm. Most occurred in domestic settings, often alcohol-fueled, typically targeting family members or acquaintances. But these numbers only capture what's been reported and prosecuted. Independent investigations suggest the real toll could be 2 or 3 times higher. The individual cases reveal systematic horror. Sergei Kozlov, a Wagner fighter who returned home and murdered his pregnant 18-year-old partner with such brutality that documenting her 138 injuries required multiple pages. Then there's the case of Ivan Rosomakin, a convicted murderer who was recruited by Wagner, completed his combat service, and promptly killed again after returning home. When local media asked if he'd be allowed to sign another military contract, the question wasn't treated as absurd. Or consider what happened in Achinsk, where veteran Kirill Chepligin allegedly murdered both his ex-wife and her new partner in broad daylight. Security cameras captured him chasing the woman across a snowy playground before stabbing her to death while she screamed for help. These aren't isolated incidents of combat stress or PTSD episodes. These are calculated acts of violence by men who have learned that killing solves problems and that Russian society will protect them as long as they're considered heroes. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Many of these crimes are being treated leniently by Russian courts. Military service is now considered a mitigating factor in criminal sentencing. In about 2/3 of cases involving veteran defendants, judges have reduced sentences or dismissed charges entirely because the accused served their country. This represents something unprecedented: the state-sponsored militarization of criminality. Up to 35% of fighters on average suffer PTSD, roughly 150,000 men requiring psychological support that doesn't exist. Some returning fighters have been conditioned to solve problems through violence and now operate in a society where police response is functionally non-existent. But here's what Russian authorities aren't telling you. The psychological damage goes far beyond individual veterans. Experts are now documenting something called secondary PTSD, affecting the families and communities of returning fighters. Wives, children, and neighbors are developing trauma symptoms just from living around these men. Domestic violence rates in military families have skyrocketed. Psychologist Ludmila Petronovskaya has warned that families and Russian society should exercise caution around returning veterans because many will be psychologically unstable. Meanwhile, many struggle adjusting to civilian wages after earning massive combat bonuses. Some refuse jobs paying less than military service. The result? A turn toward organized crime for easy money. Criminal syndicates now recruit ex-soldiers as contract killers and enforcers, prompting rivals to militarize in response. Khaki gangs, entirely veteran-composed criminal units, clash with established organizations, intensifying violence nationwide. Meanwhile, weapons flood the black market. In just May and June 2025, authorities dismantled 157 arms trafficking rings across 51 regions, seizing grenade launchers and 140 kilograms of explosives. That's enough firepower to outfit a militia, and represents only what they found. The state created this monster by weaponizing criminals. Now it can't control what it unleashed. What we're witnessing represents the fundamental unraveling of the social contract that holds civilization together. Citizens pay taxes and follow laws in exchange for basic security and order. In Russia, that agreement lies shattered. Every ruble bombing Ukrainian cities is one not spent on domestic law enforcement. Every officer recruited for foreign combat leaves civilians more vulnerable at home. Russians increasingly understand this brutal calculus, and resentment is building. In affected regions, residents stage protests demanding police protection. Former law enforcement officials warn that unsolved crimes could trigger outbursts of social negativity as people lose faith in state institutions. This threatens Putin's core legitimacy, built on ending 1990s chaos through authoritarian stability. His implicit deal was simple: surrender political freedom for economic prosperity and personal security. Now prosperity vanishes while crime explodes, yet authoritarianism intensifies. People expect civilized societies to maintain rule of law. Without it, regime support can evaporate rapidly. The 2023 Prigozhin mutiny offered a preview of internal instability's dangers. That revolt failed partly because most Russians still trusted their government and believed in military victory. But conditions have deteriorated dramatically since then. Police forces that remained loyal during Wagner's march may no longer exist in many regions. The vigilante groups Putin tolerates could easily redirect their weapons toward authorities if leadership fails to serve their interests. And here's something that should chill every world leader. Russia's regional governors are already quietly preparing for potential breakdown scenarios. Some are reportedly building relationships with local strongmen and militia leaders as insurance policies in case central authority collapses. We're seeing the emergence of what experts call security feudalism, where different armed groups control different territories based on their ability to project force rather than legal authority. In some regions, it's vigilante groups like Russkaya Obshchina. In others, it's veteran-led criminal organizations. In still others, it's a combination of corrupt police, private security firms, and paramilitary units that operate more like medieval armies than modern law enforcement. This mirrors how states collapse, not through sudden revolution, but gradual authority erosion until central control only extends to select territories while local strongmen dominate the rest. The trajectory toward total breakdown is accelerating beyond anyone's control. Consider the mathematics: 90,000 police vacancies in late 2022, 152,000 by spring 2024, 172,000 by early 2025. That's not gradual decline, that's systemic collapse. The forces driving this disintegration show no signs of abating. The Ukrainian war continues indefinitely. Officers keep leaving for higher military pay. Battle-scarred veterans return in growing numbers to a society unprepared for their reintegration. But the scale of this crisis dwarfs any historical precedent Russia has faced. After Afghanistan's withdrawal, crime spiked and veterans struggled, but the numbers remained manageable. The Ukrainian conflict involves vastly more people. Hundreds of thousands trained in violence, many with serious criminal backgrounds, returning to territories where effective law enforcement no longer exists. Unlike Afghan veterans, these men include tens of thousands of former convicts with extensive criminal experience. They've endured extreme violence for extended periods and now re-enter communities where police response has become essentially theoretical. Historical parallels offer sobering warnings. Post-World War II Soviet crime rates significantly increased from 1944 to 1946, prompting Stalin to massively expand his repressive apparatus. But Stalin commanded millions of loyal security personnel. Putin watches his forces drain away to foreign battlefields while armed groups and criminal syndicates fill the vacuum. Some experts suggest Putin might respond by assigning returning veterans new foreign missions, launching additional acts of aggression to prevent domestic destabilization. In other words, the internal security breakdown could drive Russia toward even greater international aggression. But there's another possibility that's genuinely terrifying: gradual state fragmentation. If current trends persist, we might witness regional strongmen emerging, armed militias controlling territories, and central authority existing only in name outside major urban centers. Western intelligence agencies are already documenting how the Kremlin leverages criminal networks for sabotage and cyber attacks in Europe. Battle-hardened ex-convicts are becoming key assets in hybrid warfare against NATO countries. If Russia fragments internally while maintaining these criminal intelligence networks abroad, we could see something unprecedented: a nuclear-armed failed state that projects instability globally through organized crime and terrorism. Imagine regions of Russia controlled by veteran warlords who finance themselves through drug trafficking, arms dealing, and contract killing, while still having access to Soviet-era weapons stockpiles and potentially even tactical nuclear materials. This isn't science fiction. Intelligence analysts are already mapping scenarios where Russian organized crime groups, empowered by state collapse, become transnational security threats that dwarf anything we've seen from traditional terrorist organizations. But there's another possibility that's genuinely terrifying: gradual state fragmentation. If current trends persist, we might witness regional strongmen emerging, armed militias controlling territories, and central authority existing only in name outside major urban centers. Consider the implications for global security: a nuclear-armed nation with thousands of tactical weapons scattered across territories experiencing localized governmental breakdown. If Russia fails to implement massive rehabilitation and weapons control programs, and everything suggests they won't, they could face an internal security crisis worse than anything that followed Chechnya or Afghanistan. The country is conducting a vast, uncontrolled experiment in what happens when you weaponize criminals, destroy your police force, and let vigilantes run wild. And we're all about to find out how that experiment ends. The situation has become genuinely heartbreaking to witness: a nuclear superpower voluntarily dismantling its own civilization. Russia has engineered a perfect storm: depleted law enforcement, traumatized veterans, empowered vigilante groups, weaponized criminals, and flooding black markets. Each element amplifies the others in an accelerating spiral beyond institutional control. Today's vigilante solutions could become tomorrow's warlord territories. Current veteran heroes might evolve into organized crime kingpins. The weapons trafficking networks won't disappear when hostilities end. Most dangerously, an entire generation is growing up with toxic beliefs: violence solves problems, laws don't apply equally, power, not justice, defines who wins. A generation raised to believe that might trump right, the same generation that might ignore a woman screaming through a door at 4:55 a.m. because they've learned that nobody's coming to help anyway. This is how civilizations unravel, not through foreign conquest, but internal decay reaching critical mass. Russia may have already crossed that threshold. The data speaks definitively, the trends accelerate relentlessly, and the government prioritizes external warfare over internal stability. What unfolds next will determine whether Russia remains a functioning state or transforms into something entirely different: a nuclear-armed collection of territories governed by whoever commands the most firepower. For the sake of both Russian citizens and global security, one hopes Moscow finally hears these alarm bells. But if current patterns persist, we might witness the real-time disintegration of one of history's major powers. And that breakdown won't remain confined with Russian borders. Can Russia pull back from the brink, or is this descent irreversible? Drop your thoughts in the comments and hit subscribe for breakdowns that go beyond the headlines. Because what happens in Russia won't stay there, and the world needs to be ready.
Russia is in chaos. Trains are derailing, recruitment centers are burning, and fuel depots hundreds of miles from the front lines keep mysteriously exploding. This isn't the war Putin promised. It's not even the one he understands anymore. Because what's tearing Russia apart right now isn't NATO, it's Russians. Ordinary citizens, underground fighters, cyber saboteurs. Some working for Ukraine, others acting alone, all united by one quiet goal: bleed the regime from the inside. And it's working. The Kremlin can't stop it, the military can't track it, and Putin, the man who promised to restore order, is watching his empire rot from within. This isn't a future scenario. The secret war has already started, and it may be the one that finally brings Russia down. For decades, Vladimir Putin's Russia projected an image of unassailable stability. State media trumpeted national unity. Dissent was smothered before it could spread. When Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, any cracks in the facade were swiftly papered over with fear. Anti-war demonstrations were crushed within hours. Criticism of the special military operation was criminalized overnight. Speaking out could mean prison or worse. On the surface, the regime's iron grip seemed firm, a monolith of power tolerating no disloyalty. But beneath that surface, discontent was simmering. Moscow's confidence rested on familiar tools: fear and repression to contain any internal dissent. Millions were expected to nod along with state propaganda, even as anxiety and grief crept into Russian homes. Casualties at the front mounted, sanctions squeezed the economy, thousands of families began whispering questions the Kremlin dared not acknowledge. Putin's rule was built on a brittle bargain: silence and obedience in exchange for stability. As long as Russians remained passive, the cracks in his system stayed hidden beneath the glossy veneer of unity. But history has a way of undermining regimes that refuse to see their own decay. In early 2022, the Kremlin could still pretend that all was well, that Russians were rallying around the flag. It was an illusion. Unseen by nightly news cameras, small acts of defiance were beginning to multiply. Putin's war, meant to solidify his legacy, was instead lighting the fuse of an internal implosion, and nobody in the Kremlin saw it coming. It began at the fringes of Putin's expanding empire. As Russian troops stormed into Ukraine's oblasts in 2022, they expected to be welcomed as liberators, a grave miscalculation. The illusion that Ukrainians would greet Putin's army with flowers and tears of joy vanished almost immediately. Instead, an angry resistance flared in the occupied territories, defying Moscow's narrative at every turn. When open protest was met with abductions, torture, and execution of local Ukrainian leaders, resistance didn't die. It simply went underground. In towns like Melitopol and Mariupol, clandestine groups carried out daring acts of sabotage. In one dramatic incident, partisans slipped explosives into a vehicle carrying a Russian drone crew. The blast failed to kill its targets, but it sent a clear message. Soon after, in Luhansk, bombs planted beneath Russian military vehicles did hit that mark. The explosion killed 4 Russian soldiers who they thought were safe behind front lines. They weren't isolated pranks. They were the opening shots of an organized underground war. By night, Ukrainian partisans and local collaborators moved in secret, cutting supply lines, eliminating collaborators, and spying on Russian troops. In Crimea, infiltrators filmed fighter jets taking off from Sakai Air Base, feeding real-time intelligence to Ukraine's military planners. A vast occupied land that Moscow claimed as its own was turning into a nightmare of constant, unseen rebellion. Each act of sabotage carried outsized significance in the climate of total repression. Under occupation, even tiny gestures of defiance, a spray-painted Ukrainian trident on a wall, a leaflet slipped under a door, became profoundly meaningful. They showed that fear had not crushed the will to resist. After Russia's swift offensive seized Kherson and Zaporizhia, partisan militias sprang up almost immediately, derailing trains, blowing up bridges, and assassinating puppet officials. Russian forces responded with brutal crackdowns. By late 2022, open resistances in places like Mariupol had dwindled under the weight of terror. But the embers of rebellion never died out. They simply glowed, waiting for a gust of wind to roar back into flame. That wind came as the war ground on. By 2023, Ukraine's special services began coordinating more closely with underground fighters. Sabotage efforts became more sophisticated, targeting military depots, railroads, and communications hubs vital to the Russian war machine. The pattern was unmistakable. Wherever Putin's troops tried to entrench, the ground beneath them was starting to burn. And then the flames of partisan resistance leapt over Ukraine's borders entirely, into Russia itself. What had begun as local insurgencies on occupied soil spread like wildfire into the Russian heartland. Suddenly, sabotage was erupting across the vast expanse of Russia, from the European frontiers to the Far East. Putin's own backyard was no longer secure. A secret war was unfolding deep inside Russia, waged by shadowy figures who struck at night and vanished by dawn. Near-daily fires, explosions, and technical failures began afflicting Russia's railways, military facilities, and critical infrastructure. The Kremlin struggled to comprehend, let alone contain, this spreading insurgency. In the Kursk region, a series of mysterious incidents sent shockwaves through Russia's security apparatus. One night, a massive explosion rocked a rail yard. Ukrainian special forces, working with a Russian partisan network, had destroyed a key Iskander ballistic missile loader and a Harmonia air defense radar in a daring raid. The message was chilling. Even here on Russian soil, hundreds of kilometers from the front, the war could strike like lightning. In the following weeks, sabotage struck in waves, a relay cabinet blown up in the distant Vologda, arson attacks torching multiple communications towers in Bashkortostan, a rash of fires hitting electrical panels and railway signal boxes from the Moscow suburbs all the way to Irkutsk. Local officials were baffled or in denial. Many incidents were officially dismissed as unexplained technical failures, an attempt to hide the alarming truth from the public, but everyone knew that something was very, very wrong. Perhaps the bolder strike came in the heart of Russia's capital region. In the late 2025, saboteurs infiltrated the Moscow outskirts and blew up sections of the Ring pipeline, a set of fuel lines feeding Moscow's major refineries and airports. The blast knocked out all three fuel lines at once, halting supplies of gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel to the capital. Putin's officials scrambled to send emergency repair teams across the region. The symbolism was stark, a pipeline vital to Moscow's economy torn apart from within. The war was no longer a distant news item on Donetsk or Zaporizhia. It was now a rumble beneath the feet of ordinary Russians in Moscow suburbs. These weren't random acts of vandalism. They were a coordinated campaign to erode the Russian state's ability to wage war and to undermine its aura of total control. Intelligence reports noted how sabotage incidents now appear in clusters, hitting logistics, communications, and security forces at the same time. It was as if an invisible hand were orchestrating a simultaneous assault on the pillars of Putin's war machine. Every derailed train or depot fire forces Moscow to divert soldiers to guard duty, stretching an already strained army even thinner. Russian commanders, who once felt secure behind the front, now must wonder what will explode next. But here's what should terrify Putin most. Many of these strikes inside Russia weren't the work of Ukrainian commandos alone. They had help from Russians within his own borders. A clandestine partisan movement was taking root among his own citizens. The vast Russian Federation, long held together by propaganda and fear, was now showing signs of fracture. That point was driven home dramatically in June 2023, where Putin's once loyal mercenaries, the Wagner Group, mutinied and marched towards Moscow. In both low-level sabotage and high-level rebellion, the pattern was the same. The facade of control was crumbling, and in the shadows of this secret war, Russian citizens themselves were emerging as the newest and perhaps most potent insurgents. The most profound sign of Putin's loosening grip is that Russians are now fighting Russians to end his rule. What began as isolated acts of anti-war arson by desperate individuals has evolved into organized resistance. New anti-Putin partisan groups have sprouted across Russia, openly claiming responsibility for sabotage and urging others to join them. They operate under names like Liberator, Stop the Wagons, and Black Spark, signaling their intent to stop the Kremlin's war machine by any means. These aren't foreign agents or Ukrainian infiltrators. They are Russia's own sons and daughters turning against the regime. One of the most prominent is the Freedom of Russia Legion. Formed by defectors and volunteers determined to overthrow Putin, this legion fights alongside Ukraine, but its members are ethnic Russians, aiming their guns back home. In May 2023, the Freedom of Russia Legion, together with the allied Russian Volunteer Corps, made headlines with an armed raid into Russia's Belgorod region. For the first time in this war, the Kremlin's forces had to confront an incursion on their own soil led by ethnic Russian fighters carrying a white-blue-white flag of rebellion. That raid was psychologically seismic. It shattered the Kremlin's narrative that Russians universally back the war. Here were Russians under arms, literally cleansing their house of Putin's filth, as one Legion fighter put it. The partisans filmed themselves on Russians' territory, declaring "For Russia, for freedom," a battle cry against their own dictator. Legion members say this is only the beginning. A Legion commander, known only as Caesar, vowed to intensify the fight both from outside and inside Russia. He spoke of a very big resistance movement present inside Russia, a guerrilla network burning war commissariats and destroying railways. According to Caesar, this underground war is growing by the day. More people see that they are on the right side and want to join them. Putin, who built his power on the mantra of stability, now faces the spectre of a domestic insurgency. Other groups bolster this uprising. In March 2023, Russia's Bryansk region awoke to astonishing news. An armed unit had crossed from Ukraine and briefly seized villages. Kiev stated it had nothing to do with it. And indeed, the Russian volunteer corps claimed the raid. Masked fighters recorded a video addressing ordinary Russians. "We are not at war with civilians. It's time you realize you're not slaves. Start a rebellion. Fight." Such words spoke on Russian soil by Russian dissidents were unprecedented. Meanwhile, a clandestine network called Black Spark had been striking critical targets in Russia's rear. This Russian partisan cell operates in concert with Ukrainian special forces. Together, they have conducted high-impact raids aimed at crippling Russia's ability to wage war. In one recent operation, Black Spark units coordinated with Ukraine's elite SSO to destroy a modern Buk M3 air defense system and a Nebo-U radar in Rostov Oblast. The SSO described these missions as inflicting 1,000 cuts on the enemy. The strategy is clear: bleed Putin's forces through constant scattered pain until the once mighty war machine collapses from exhaustion. What's remarkable is that those wielding the knife are Russians themselves, citizens disgusted with Putin's war, turning their sabotage skills against their homeland's military. By leveraging such insiders, Ukraine exploits a deadly advantage: the rot within Russia's system. Consider Artesh, a clandestine movement of Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars united in resistance. Founded in Crimea in 2022, Artesh, which fittingly means fire in Turkish, soon spread its operations on occupied Kherson, then Donetsk and Zaporizhia, and now deep into Russia itself. It boasts an extensive network, some 7,000 members by one count, blending in under the very noses of Russian authorities. Artesh agents have repeatedly struck at Russia's logistics. They derail trains, blow up rail junctions, and even claim credit for assassinating pro-war figures. In November 2025, Artesh partisans penetrated a major rail hub in Rostov-on-Don, just 40 miles from Ukraine's border, and set a military supply train's locomotive ablaze. Video on their Telegram channel showed the engine engulfed in flames, burning bright against the night. Artesh wrote that the operation disrupted train schedules carrying ammunition and reserves to the front. From derailed trains in Siberia to unexplained explosions in military research institutes near Moscow, the pattern is unmistakable. Russians inside the country are actively subverting Putin's war. Even ordinary citizens not formally in any group have been moved to action or manipulation. In 2023 and 2024, a bizarre trend saw dozens of arson attacks on enlistment offices, banks, and police cars across Russia, often carried out by pensioners and teenagers who were cynically duped by online recruiters. Some were promised money to torch government property, others were tricked into thinking they were doing something else entirely. Every segment of Russian society, from disillusioned veterans to grandmothers with a grudge, from nationalist mercenaries to liberal students, is contributing, wittingly or not, to this growing tapestry of defiance. The cumulative effect is stunning. Artesh alone has been linked to at least 32 acts of sabotage inside Russia in 2025, and Artesh is just one player. The Freedom of Russia Legion promises more raids to wash away the stain of Putin's regime. Black Spark relentlessly picks off high-value targets behind the lines, and countless unknown Russians in dozens of cities carry out quiet acts of resistance. A rail switch tampered with here, a military recruitment office set on fire there. That never even makes the news. Vladimir Putin is facing something he never expected and cannot easily crush: a rebellion from within. diffused across the country with no single leader or center. This is an insurgency of many faces, united only by a shared conviction that Putin's war is a national catastrophe. The longer the war drags on, the stronger this underground movement grows. But these attacks are merely symptoms of something far deeper. They signal a more existential crisis for the Kremlin, symptoms of systemic decay spreading through the very foundations of the regime. Autocracies often appear solid until, quite suddenly, they're not. Economically and socially, the strain of war is eroding the glue that held Russia together. Over 650,000 Russians have fled the country since the invasion began, the largest wave of emigration in Russia's modern history. Those aren't draft dodgers alone, they include the young, educated, and creative citizens who felt they had no future under a repressive wartime regime. The brain drain and the loss of talent will haunt Russia for years. Those who remain are often silenced or isolated by pervasive propaganda, but as casualties mount, especially among poor ethnic minority regions, cracks of anger have surfaced. Mothers in Dagestan boldly protested the conscription of their sons in 2022. Whispers of discontent have spread from soldiers' families across the country. The Kremlin has tried to plaster over these cracks with lies and more fear, passing draconian laws, jailing anyone who speaks too plainly about defeat. Yet reality is catching up. The greater threat now festers at home, a breakdown of the social contract that underpinned Putin's rule. For years, Russians tolerated or even supported Putin as long as he delivered order, pride, and economic stability. The war in Ukraine, sold on TV as a short, triumphant special operation, has instead dragged Russia into a quagmire of attrition. The state throws untrained conscripts into the meat grinder while daily life for ordinary people becomes more impoverished and restricted. Mistrust and cynicism are spreading, and as if to embody the internal collapse of unity, Putin's one-time ally, Yevgeny Prigozhin, led the Wagner mercenaries in a brazen armed mutiny, seizing the military headquarters and marching on Moscow in June 2023. For 36 hours, the world saw the unbelievable. Putin's vaunted security forces standing aside as a private army drove to within a few hundred kilometers of the Kremlin. Though the mutiny was aborted, the damage was done. The illusion of Putin's absolute control was shattered. If even his loyal warlord could rebel, who else in the inner circle might waver? Psychologically, Russia is beginning to feel war at home. Even disruptions that have no direct military impact can have a profound psychological effect. A fire at a distant oil depot or a train derailed by saboteurs might seem minor in the grand scheme, but such events dominate headlines and fuel public anxiety at minimal cost to those who cause them. A steady drumbeat of unexplained disasters makes Russians wonder what's really going on. It creates the impression that the country's security is penetrable, that the state is not in full control. The atmosphere of uncertainty and vulnerability is corrosive. It chips away at the central narrative of Putin's regime, the promise that he is the strongman who keeps Russia safe and strong. In the villages near the Ukrainian border, shelling and raids have become a terrifying new normal. Families there feel abandoned and angry that Moscow can't protect them. In the great cities, each new incident, a drone attack on a skyscraper, a blast on a railway, undercuts the myth that the war is far away. Russians are beginning to sense that the war is closer than they were told. It's on their streets, perhaps in their neighbor's garage, plotting the next firebombing. The Kremlin's reflex is to double down on denial. State media seldom acknowledges partisan attacks. Officials attribute explosions to accidents or blame lone Ukrainian terrorists to avoid admitting any local opposition. But denial is a double-edged sword. By refusing to confront the reality of internal dissent, Putin's regime only lets the cancer spread unseen. History teaches us that when rulers cling to denial, they lose the chance to right the ship. The late Soviet leadership similarly avoided acknowledging how deeply the Afghan war and economic malaise had alienated their populace, until the USSR unraveled almost overnight. In Tsarist Russia during World War I, the Tsar's inner circle dismissed bread riots and immunities until it was too late, and 300 years of Romanov rule collapsed in days. Today, Putin insists everything is under control. even as cracks split the walls around him. In this 25th year of Putin's regime, the Kremlin still outwardly projects confidence. Grand parades on Red Square, fiery speeches denouncing external enemies, arrests of traitors to scare the rest. But beneath that facade, a secret war is tearing the country apart. It's a war of saboteurs and partisans, of whispers and flames in the dark, of citizens who have decided they will no longer be cogs in Putin's war machine. It's the kind of war any autocrat fears most, the enemy within, impossible to fully identify or eliminate. With each passing month, Putin is losing control, not in one cataclysmic event, but in a slow, relentless bleed. A rail junction disabled here, an ammo depot torched there, a protest sign-off in a far village, a mutiny brewing in the ranks. These are individual threads slowly unweaving the tapestry of the regime. In the end, the consequences of ruling through fear and denial are coming due. Fear can jail or silence people, it cannot truly command their loyalty. Denial can paper over problems, it cannot make them disappear. By silencing peaceful critics, Putin ensured that the anger in his society would find other outlets. And it has, in Molotov cocktails and rogue drones. By denying the very possibility of Russian descent, he is blind into the mutiny he is brewing under his feet. There is a powerful irony at play. Putin launched a real war to crush an independent Ukraine, insisting that the greatest threat to Russia came from outside. Instead, he has ignited the fuse on his own undoing from within. The systemic decay, the disillusionment, the collapse of unity, the cultural erosion was accelerated by his choices. And now the bill has come due. The Russian state, like so many autocracies before, risks falling victim to what it thought was its strengths, the ruthless suppression of its people. For a while, fear can hold walls upright, but when enough bricks have crumbled, even the thickest walls collapse under their own weight. No one can say exactly when or how this will end. Perhaps Putin will manage to smother the fires of resistance a while longer. Perhaps the secret war will keep simmering in the shadows. But one day, perhaps sooner than expected, a spark might catch that cannot be put out. A nation fueled by fear can break suddenly, like a dam holding back an immense pressure which finally bursts from within. In that chilling moment, the system fails all at once, and those who for so long pretended everything was fine are left stunned at how fast the mighty fall. History is watching. In Russia today, the slow unraveling continues, thread by thread. A train sabotage, a slogan of freedom whispered, a lie exposed. Putin's empire of fear is bleeding from 1,000 cuts. And if there's one lesson to be drawn, it's that the soul of a nation cannot be indefinitely silenced. The truth finds a way, whether in words or in flames. The secret war, once in the shadows, is now ripping Russia apart for all to see. So, what do you think? Is Putin's grip finally slipping beyond repair? Or will the Kremlin find a way to crush the rebellion before it spreads even further? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to Fall of Nations for more on the forces reshaping our world.
Putin didn't just invade Ukraine, he's now invading Russia. One draft notice, one border closure, one terrifying young man at a time. The war isn't just at the front anymore, it's at the nightclub, the gym, the train station. Because in Putin's Russia, if you're a man between 18 and 30, every outing could be your last as a civilian. Step into the wrong metro station, and a facial recognition camera might flag you. Step into the wrong bar, and the cops might drag you out. Straight to the trenches. This is a country at war with itself. And while the Kremlin pretends this isn't a mobilization, everything from border bans to secret draft laws says otherwise. Russia is broke. The bonuses for soldiers are vanishing. The bodies are piling up. And now Putin has only one option left: trap his own people and squeeze them for blood. This is the collapse no one talks about, because it isn't just military, it's psychological. Russia is becoming a prison, not just in a metaphor, but in law. And the scariest part? Most Russians still don't realize they're already locked in. Let's break down the full story. Putin and Kim Jong-un are BFFs these days, and Putin might be feeling a little inspired, because Russia is looking more and more like North Korea. In October 2025, the State Duma began to consider a new proposal. Andrei Kovalenko, head of Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation, called it a new Iron Curtain. If the law goes through, Russian nationals will no longer be allowed to travel to NATO countries during wartime. Unless they can pay, of course. For everyone else, closed airports, expensive tickets, and domestic tourism in the style of North Korea, he said. What's going on? Well, there's already a law that bans Russian men who've been called up to the military from leaving the country. That law came on the books in August of 2023. The moment they get the draft notice, they're on the hook. Failure to comply can mean the loss of driver's licenses, a ban on selling property, and a permanent stay in the motherland. And that's just the least of it. But first things first, you might not like it, but it makes sense on some level. There has to be some sort of punishment for violating national draft laws, or else the country might face manpower shortages in the war. In the United States, all men who turn 18 still have to register for the Selective Service System on penalty of a felony conviction that carries a $250,000 fine and 5 years in the slammer. Ukraine also banned all men ages 18 to 60 from leaving the country in February of 2022. Just like that. But Russia is taking things a big step further. Putin suffered an embarrassment when around 600,000 well-educated Russian men hightailed it out of the motherland. Once he called reservists to the colors in 2022, that was it. They were out of there. And actually, that was just the second act. More than 1 million Russians crossed the border between their country and Georgia between March and November of 2022. It all rattled Putin. He needed to do something. Again, that's normal for a country at war, no matter the justification for the war. In the first half of 2025, Russians made 13.7 million trips overseas. Turkey was the most popular destination. 19% of those trips were across the Black Sea. This apparently bothered Putin's government enough that the Duma is now considering passing the law. Maybe too many of them are taking a permanent vacation. With well over 1 million casualties and counting, Putin's running out of options. He needs manpower badly. He can't let the potential pool of recruits get ideas about staying in Turkey for too long. For Russian citizens, though, the law would only close the loop. The ones that get out are already lucky. Here's where the similarities with the United States and Ukraine end. The ones with certain other countries begin. But before we get into them, please consider subscribing. It helps us keep talking about stories like this that are too complicated for your nightly news broadcast or social media feed. Kim Jong-un took full advantage of the pandemic to tighten his grip on the North Korean people, as if that was even possible. Turns out it was. He was already building electrified fences to keep them in. But then he made a new law. North Koreans now can't even leave their home province without a special permit. The government has to control every move. The Russian government isn't talking about anything like that yet, but it might not need to. The Russian economy is doing that on its own. The Kremlin's put a lot of new rubles into the economy over the last 4 years, and that means only one thing. Inflation has skyrocketed. 13.75% in 2022, 5.86% in 2023, 8.44% in 2024, and about 9.27% in 2025. High inflation means only one thing. Russia's central bank has had to step in and raise interest rates to 21%. The inflation means that Russians can barely afford bread, eggs, or sugar now. How are they supposed to pay for transportation or hotels? Welcome to the North Korean experience. So the economy and subsistence are doing a lot to keep the Russian people in place. They're all exactly where they need to be. Less movement means it's easier for the government to track them and put them on the draft boards. But Putin learned from his other BFF just in case. The new draft laws have come with some high-tech insurance policies to make sure they're enforced. Before the war, there was a 20-day grace period for conscripts to report for duty. Not anymore. As of November 2025, you're trapped instantly. And Putin wanted to make sure people couldn't have an "I didn't know the order was in the mail" excuse. The 2023 law meant draft notices are now posted electronically and marked on the official register of legal documents as soon as they get put up. In other words, effective immediately. Individuals that have officially been called up must surrender their passports within 5 days' notice. They will only be returned when that individual's tour of service ends. So, if you're a man in Russia between the ages of 18 and 30, you're expected to keep checking your inbox. The moment the notice is in there, that's it. It's over, whether you see it or not. And once you're tagged by the system, you're not just trapped, you're hunted if you don't show up to your station. And the system gets stronger all the time. Just this November, Putin signed yet another law. There is now a 30-day expiration date for electronic draft notices. That sounds like a good thing, but it's not. Military draft boards used to be able to keep troops called up on standby indefinitely. Now they have 30 days to actually deploy those troops. Russia still does its call-ups on a biannual basis, but now draftees will be sent to their service points at 2 periods, between April 1st and July 15th, then another round from October 1st to December 31st. The new law is a step closer to a year-round draft in Russia. Lag times and bottlenecks will be reduced now. Russian troops will get sent to the front faster. Why so frantic? Because for Putin and his government, there's no choice. Russia is well past 1 million casualties now. Security experts predict that its military capability will degrade considerably through 2026. War spending has cannibalized the rest of the economy. It can't be sustained for too much longer. It's now or never. That means more troops have to get sent to the front. Putin has to grab as much territory as possible so he can sell a victory in Ukraine to a Russian public that has sacrificed a lot. So, what happens to those who try to run? You're about to see just how far Russia will go to crush escape. Xi Jinping has spent more time with Putin than any other foreign leader. It's not just for business. The two are said to have a close personal relationship, too. So that means Xi is happy to let Putin in on more of his methods and sell him surveillance equipment. It starts with tracking and facial recognition software. The system was first tested in select regions like Sakhalin, Mariel, and Ryazan in 2024. It proved to be so effective that the government started to roll it out nationwide this year. So, what does it do? The Gosuslugi government portal is the device that sends people their electronic draft card, but it has a double life. As soon as the notices get sent out, they're entered into all the surveillance databases at the border checkpoints. Their personal information, their physical attributes, their identities, probably even their moods. The border guards know everything. If a drafted Russian man tries to get past a checkpoint, there will be an FSA agent waiting for him. Once in custody, he'll be warned that his failure to report for service will lead to criminal charges. Russia's been using the system to target 135,000 men in the fall of 2025, and it's getting the job done. But Russia still isn't North Korea. Escape is possible. But escaping from Russia when you're drafted is still a bit like trying to escape from North Korea. The geopolitics doesn't favor it. Russian borders with other NATO countries are short and under heavy surveillance. Besides, most of the Russian draftees aren't anywhere near there. The people dying in Ukraine aren't from Moscow or St. Petersburg. They're not from the most densely packed parts of European Russia. That would come with some unpleasant political consequences. They come from Russia's poorer minority and geographically isolated communities. Siberia, the Caucasus Mountains, places where there are less ethnic Russians. The numbers tell the story. Around 77% of Russia's population lives in the European heartland. You'd think that naturally a similar proportion of the mobilized troops would come from there, right? Russia isn't honest about its casualty figures, but investigative journalists did some deep diving at the end of 2023. That was an important time period because it was the first full year that Putin used the mobilized conscripts in large numbers. They found something astonishing. In the east, far past the Ural Mountains, you'll find the Russian Republic of Buryatia, population almost 980,000 in the 2021 census. By comparison, Moscow had around 13 million. But by December 2023, 18% of the war's total casualties came from just this place. Dagestan and Chechnya are also favorites for the Russian war machine. If the men there can't get to the top of the UFC, they're almost certain to be sent to the front. The numbers proved it. 15% of the casualties came from Dagestan, and another 12% from Chechnya. It's actually easy for outside journalists to find. As early as the spring of 2022, a lot of the confirmed casualties had names suggesting that they came from Russia's North Caucasus Federal District. If you're an ethnic minority in Russia and you live outside the European heartland, your chances of dying in Ukraine weren't just a few times higher than your countrymen in the West or North. They were 75 times higher. It got to the point that the former president of Mongolia, Sakajian Elbadorj, said that Russia's minorities were being treated like cannon fodder, and he invited many of them to come across the border where they would be treated much better. So, if you're a Russian man that wants to take up that invitation, you have to look at other escape routes. The border with Kazakhstan alone is 7,644 kilometers, the longest continuous land border in the world. It borders 14 other countries by land, and 15 if you include the maritime border with the United States. The guards can't be watching everywhere, but getting across all the security, across such vast stretches of land, when you're living in poverty? Tough. The people that managed to get out of the country early had resources, and the surveillance network has become much more sophisticated since then. There's also another obstacle. Russia doesn't punish the families of people who escape like North Korea. At least, not yet. But the men who would like to go on the run often have to make that tough choice anyway. Getting out is hard enough. Getting out alongside wives and children is even harder. So the choice is either to leave them behind or get sent right to the front. Yet the human drive for freedom from autocracy seems to be impossible to hold down. If it can exist in North Korea, it can definitely exist in Russia. That's why there's something like a Russian underground railroad now, dedicated to getting people out. It's understandably not based in Russia, though. It's a Georgian NGO called Idat Lesam, which translates to Go by the Forest in English. The meaning isn't literal, though. It's a play on words back from Soviet times. The real meaning? Get lost. By the spring of 2023, it helped 6,800 Russian men break out of the prison their boss was building. The founder himself is an exiled Russian, Grigory Sverdlin. He got on Putin's bad side years ago by being an anti-homelessness activist. Hard to believe, but true. The organization helps them get all over the world, not just to border countries like Kazakhstan or popular travel spots like Turkey, but to as far afield as Argentina. Go by the Forest doesn't say how it gets people out, but it does have some advice. Change residences frequently to stay ahead of the authorities, and communicate through Telegram, which offers end-to-end encryption. Instagram was popular once, but it's now closed off. The mountains or endless steppe might be a daunting journey, but for people who are looking to escape, they're all much better prospects than a trip through the military. It's not just about the dangers of the front. Reporting for duty alone is frightening. Recruits sometimes don't even have proper beds. Footage has shown them sleeping on the floor, so you can imagine what equipping them must be like. Imagine showing up as you're ordered, and then you find that the body armor you're supposed to get isn't a real set. Sometimes it just looks like the real thing. Sometimes it's actually just a toy designed for an airsoft paintball game. That was the experience of a lot of the mobilized troops. Where'd the real armor go? Into the pockets of corrupt logistics officers who wanted to make a quick buck on the black market. If they can't steal the whole thing, sometimes they just take the ceramic or steel plates that can make them their coin. Some of the mobilized troops knew better than to trust their superiors, so they showed up with body armor that their families bought for them on the private market. Technically, it's illegal for Russian troops to have to buy their own armor. The state is supposed to provide, but the joke's on the draftees. That armor their family spent a lot on tends to get stolen, either by more corrupt officers or from more seasoned veterans who can't resist a little hazing. The stolen equipment then gets sold on platforms like Avito, or put onto other troops that the bosses want to preferentially survive. And if that's not shocking enough, just wait. Some of the mobilized troops don't even get the basic weapons they're supposed to. Some of the draftees get the AKM rifle, first introduced in 1959. They were just broken out of storage. Reliability after all that time is one concern, but it was also a logistical nightmare. Regular Russian combat units use the AK-74M or AK-12 rifles, chambered for the 5.45mm rounds, but the AKM uses 7.62mm rounds. You know what that means. A lot of troops went to battle without ammunition. British intelligence said the conscripts were using barely functioning rifles. But don't try complaining about it. For one thing, no one will hear you. Russia looks a lot more like China these days, not in its wealth, but in its censorship. Russia started to close the internet off when the troops moved across the border. Facebook, censored. Twitter or X, banned. Google, closed down and fined for 20 decillion, 181 quintillion times bigger than the entire global economy. iPhones? Keep them precious. They're not replaceable now. YouTube still works, but the Kremlin cut the bandwidth in 2024. That means if you're trying to watch this video in Russia without a VPN, it'll feel like those old dial-up modems from the 90s, maybe worse. The nightly news channels, run by the state or by favored companies like Gazprom. So Russians tend to hear only one thing: real men serve in the military. They're told they should be proud, and stories of the meat grinder don't spread like they should. The internet's supposed to be closed until the end of the war, but don't bet on that. If you think this ends with the war, think again. For many Russians, the front line is just the beginning. What's one thing even Democratic leaders don't like to do? Give up power once they've gotten it. For Putin, the war has been an excuse to concentrate power even he never had before that. Russia now has the technology to ID anyone at any time, to own their bodies for whatever reason Putin wants. The draft isn't about obedience or patriotism, it's about control. If things get bad enough, there's now the infrastructure to prevent anyone from leaving. Just like North Korea. And just like North Korea, the borders were supposedly sealed to protect the nation. What they actually did was wall it off and destroyed it. Just no concentration camps for people trying to leave. Yet. They told us Russia had one of the most fearsome militaries on Earth. Nuclear-armed, battle-hardened, a legacy forged in World War II and feared across the West. Massive arsenals, millions of men, a superpower on paper, and a nightmare in theory. But when the time came to fight, the illusion shattered. Rusting tanks, Soviet-era logistics, generals lying to their own president, recruits with no training, ammunition from North Korea. What the hell happened to Russia's army? This isn't just another failed war, it's a total collapse of credibility and a glimpse into how empires die. So if you want to understand why Russia's military is crumbling in real time and what it means for the rest of the world, this is the video to watch. Let's start with the numbers that should terrify the Kremlin. By mid-2025, Russia's total casualties, killed and wounded, were approaching 1 million soldiers. 1 million. US and British intelligence estimate around 250,000 Russian troops have been killed in action. Another 700,000 injured, maimed, or permanently disabled. Ukraine's own count? Over 1,120,000 Russian personnel put out of action as of October 2025. That's roughly 20,000 to 30,000 casualties every single month. An entire city's worth of men gone. But here's where it gets truly insane. Russia has somehow managed to replace these losses almost as fast as they happen. How? By throwing bodies at the problem faster than Ukraine can destroy them. Around 1,000 to 1,200 new recruits per day were being funneled into the meat grinder by late 2023. Volunteers lured by massive payouts. Reservists quietly mobilized. Prisoners promised freedom. Even aging conscripts pulled from civilian life. By early 2024, Russian officials were boasting about 40,000 new contract soldiers signing up every month. Sounds impressive, right? Wrong. Here's what they didn't tell you. Most of these new contracts were just the same exhausted veterans re-signing for another tour. Or short-term renewals, not fresh blood, not willing fighters. The actual number of brand new recruits? A fraction of the propaganda. And by spring 2025, recruitment had dropped by 30%. Only around 1,700 people were signing up per day. War fatigue was setting in hard. But the real nightmare isn't the numbers, it's the quality. Russian recruits are getting as little as 2 weeks of training before being thrown into combat. 2 weeks to learn how to shoot, navigate, and survive a modern battlefield. Western soldiers train for months. Russian conscripts? They're lucky if they know which end of the rifle to point forward. This situation came to a head during Ukraine's surprise Kursk region incursion in August 2024. When a Ukrainian brigade crossed into Russian territory, entire Russian units, comprised mostly of recent conscripts, collapsed and surrendered en masse. Over 240 Russian POWs captured in just 10 days. Prison camp officials reported that about 80% were 18 to 20-year-old conscripts. Kids who'd never expected to see combat. Kids whose officers had fled at the first sign of battle. Videos shown dozens of Russian soldiers lining up to surrender without firing a single shot. No resistance, no fight. Just bewildered teenagers who didn't even know why they were there. This is Russia's mighty army in 2025. A hollow force held together by threats, bribes, and bodies pulled from the margins of society. But throwing untrained recruits at the problem is only half the disaster. The real nightmare? The equipment they're supposed to use is falling apart faster than Russia can replace it. Russia entered this war with one of the largest tank fleets on Earth. Over 12,000 tanks on paper, the T-72, the T-80, and the T-90. Thousands of armored fighting vehicles in reserve. The second best army in the world, they said. Fast forward to mid-2025. Ukrainian forces have destroyed or captured more than 10,000 Russian tanks and armored vehicles. Even conservative Western intelligence confirms over 3,000 Russian tanks destroyed. Thousands more crippled or abandoned. How did this happen? One word: design. Soviet-era Russian tanks have a fatal flaw that Western militaries figured out decades ago. The ammunition is stored directly beneath the turret, right where the crew sits. When the tank gets hit, and in modern war, it will get hit, the shells cook off in a chain reaction. The result? The turret literally explodes off the hull like a champagne cork. They call it the Jack-in-the-Box effect. Ukrainian drone operators have turned it into an art form. A well-placed javelin strike, a Turkish Bayraktar drone, even an old Soviet-era RPG in the right spot. Boom! The turret flies 50 feet into the air, and the crew is instantly dead. Western tanks, like the American M1 Abrams or the German Leopard 2, avoid this by isolating ammunition behind armored blast doors. If the ammo is hit, the explosion vents outward away from the crew. Survivability over speed. But Soviet designers? They chose a compact profile and faster reload times. They traded crew safety for a sleeker silhouette. It was a gamble that worked in the Cold War. In 2025, it's a death sentence. Russia initially sent its best tanks into Ukraine, modernized T-72Bs and T-80 BVMs. Hundreds were destroyed or seized in the first few months. By mid-2023, Russia's inventory of usable modern tanks was so depleted, they started pulling museum pieces out of storage. T-62 tanks, T-55s, models from the 1960s. Machines with paper-thin armor, obsolete optics, and engines that barely run. They're not combat vehicles, they're coffins on treads. And still, Russia keeps losing them. In a single failed assault near Avdiivka in February 2024, Russian forces lost 54 armored vehicles in one day. 16 tanks destroyed one day. Scenes like this have become routine, charred tank carcasses littering Ukrainian fields like a junkyard. By late 2024, Russia was reportedly losing 10 or more tanks per day during major engagements. Putin's government has ordered factories to surge production. but Western sanctions on high-tech components have crippled their ability to build anything advanced. Russia's most modern tank, the T-90M, can only be produced at about 15 units per month. 15. That's not nearly enough to offset the hundreds being destroyed. So Moscow is stuck refurbishing old Soviet relics from storage. Tanks that were barely adequate 40 years ago, now facing Javelin missiles, HIMARS rockets, and Ukrainian ingenuity. Roughly 40% of Russia's pre-war ready tanks have been wiped out. The vaunted Russian armored offensive? Dead in the water. And just when you think it can't get worse, wait until you hear where Russia is getting ammunition. If there's one thing Russia was supposed to dominate, it was artillery. The Soviets called it the god of war. Thousands of howitzers, millions of shells, overwhelming firepower that could turn the battlefield into a moonscape. Russia entered the war with an estimated 10,000 plus tube artillery pieces and around 3,000 multiple launch rocket systems. In the first year, Russian forces were firing 50,000 to 60,000 shells per day. It was a steel hurricane. But here's the problem with firing that many shells. Eventually, you run out. By late 2023, reports started emerging that Russian artillery units were running dangerously low of ammunition. Depots were empty. Barrels were worn out from constant firing. Some units were pulling 1950s-era howitzers out of storage just to keep guns on the line. Ukraine claims over 33,500 Russian artillery pieces have been destroyed so far. Likely an overestimate, but thousands have certainly been knocked out. Russian counter-battery fire, once overwhelming, started to slow. And that's when Putin made a desperate call to North Korea. Starting in late 2023, Kim Jong-un began a covert operation to ship millions of artillery shells to Russia. By mid-2024, South Korean intelligence estimated more than 2.5 million North Korean shells had been delivered. Ukraine's own intel puts the figure at over 4 million shells sent since mid-2023. These are the exact 122mm and 152mm calibers that Russia's Soviet-made guns use. In exchange, Putin likely offered food, oil, and possibly even missile technology to Kim's regime. Without North Korean ammo, Ukrainian officials said Russia's shelling rate would have been cut in half. Let that sink in. Russia, a supposed superpower with one of the world's largest militaries, is dependent upon North Korea to keep its guns firing. But even North Korean shells couldn't save Russia from another humiliating problem: fuel shortages. In an oil-exporting nation, Ukrainian drone strikes on key Russian oil refineries knocked out up to 38% of Russia's refining capacity by October 2025. The impact was immediate. Gasoline shortages in multiple regions, panic buying, price spikes. In September 2023, and again in 2025, the Russian government had to temporarily ban gasoline and diesel exports just to protect domestic supply. They even sought to import fuel from Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, an oil giant begging for fuel. This is what a war-strained economy looks like. Russia's god of war has been reduced to rationing ammunition, begging North Korea for shells, and struggling to keep its own refineries running. But at least Russia still has its mighty Air Force, right? Well, about that. On paper, the Russian Air Force is one of the world's largest. Around 800 to 850 fighter jets, hundreds of attack helicopters, modern fighters like the Su-34 strike bomber, and the Su-35S air superiority jet. Everyone expected Russia to quickly establish air superiority over Ukraine in 2022. Instead, Russia's Air Force has been oddly timid and largely ineffective. As of October 2025, Ukraine claims to have shot down 427 Russian planes and 346 helicopters. Even conservative counts confirm Russia has lost well over 100 aircraft. Why has Russia's air power been so disappointing? Ukrainian air defenses have made the skies a death trap. Ukraine entered the war with robust Soviet-made SAM systems and has since been reinforced with top-tier Western systems, Patriot missiles, NASAMS, Iris-T. These have made Ukrainian airspace a death trap for Russian jets. Long-range surface-to-air missiles forced Russian pilots to fly low, limiting them to frontline close-air support. But even at low altitudes, mobile Ukrainian SAM batteries ambushed them. When Russia tried more aggressive air operations in spring 2023, they lost multiple Su-34s and Su-25s in days. By 2024, Russian sorties were largely confined to launching standoff missiles from safe distances. No dogfighting, no strafing runs, just fire and retreat. Russia's aging fleet compounds the problem. A large portion of the Air Force consists of older Soviet-era models. MiG-29 fighters, Su-24 bombers, MiG-31 interceptors from the 1980s. These planes are approaching end of life. Maintenance is a nightmare. Western sanctions have made it nearly impossible to source spare parts and engines. Reports suggest Russia is cannibalizing aircraft just to keep others flying. And Western aircraft are simply better. When comparing the F-16 with the Russian Su-35, retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Dan Hampton put it bluntly, "Our planes are more durable. I wouldn't bet on the Su-35 or any Russian-made aircraft." Western experts note that the F-16 is easier to maintain and built with superior avionics. The Su-35? Large, easy to track on radar, lacking cutting-edge stealth technology. In a head-to-head fight, Western jets dominate, and Ukraine is about to get F-16s. By late 2025, Ukraine's first F-16s from NATO donors are arriving, which could tilt the air balance even further. Meanwhile, Ukrainian strikes on Russian air bases have forced Moscow to relocate aircraft hundreds of kilometers to the rear. In May and June 2025, Ukrainian drones struck Russian long-range bomber bases, damaging up to 11 Tu-95 and Tu-22M3s strategic bombers in one strike. That's according to Ukrainian officials. Whether that number is accurate or not, it spooked the Kremlin enough to invest heavily in base defenses and move planes even farther from the front. Despite having hundreds of jets, Russia couldn't control Ukrainian airspace. It's essentially an air force in hiding, present and dangerous, but unable to decisively influence the war. The sky isn't safe. The ground is a graveyard. So surely the Navy is holding the line, right? Russia's Black Sea Fleet was supposed to dominate Ukraine's coastline, blockade ports, launch missile strikes, project power across the region. Early in the war, the fleet seized strategic outposts like Snake Island and choked off Ukraine's maritime trade. But then, Ukraine struck back, and the fleet never recovered. In April 2022, Ukrainian Neptune missiles hit the cruiser Moskva, the fleet's flagship, and sent it to the bottom of the Black Sea. It was a symbolic and strategic disaster. Since then, Ukraine has continued to chip away. As of mid-October 2025, Ukrainian forces have destroyed or put out of action 29 Russian naval vessels, patrol boats, landing ships, even a Kilo-class submarine in dry dock. In September 2023, Ukraine launched a bold strike on the naval port of Sevastopol using Storm Shadow missiles, devastating a dry dock and destroying a submarine and large amphibious ship. Ukraine also deployed unmanned explosive drone boats to severely damage Russian warships. Facing these threats, Russia pulled its major ships back. By October 2023, most large combatants no longer dared operate within range of Ukrainian missiles. Many were relocated to Novorossiysk, farther east for relative safety. Without naval control, Ukraine, with international coordination, established a humanitarian corridor for merchant ships to sail from Odessa despite Russian threats. Although risky, grain ships successfully transited. By early 2024, Ukraine's grain export volumes via alternate routes had recovered to about 60 to 70% of pre-war levels. Russia's strategy of weaponizing food supply failed. Global grain prices stabilized. Ukraine continued to be a major exporter. Meanwhile, Crimea, home to Russia's Sevastopol naval base, is now regularly struck by Ukrainian drones and missiles. Fuel depots, airfields, and military facilities have been hit repeatedly. The Black Sea Fleet is now essentially on the defensive. It still launches cruise missiles at Ukraine from submarines or ships in the Caspian Sea, but it cannot meaningfully project control. By the end of June 2022, Russia even abandoned Snake Island and eased enforcement of the blockade. Any Russian ship that comes too close to Ukraine's coast risks being sunk. It's a far cry from Moscow's initial dominance. And with all this carnage, on land, in the air, at sea, you'd think Putin would cut his losses. Instead, he's doubling down on the most brutal strategy imaginable. Facing catastrophic losses in manpower and equipment, Putin has settled on a grim strategy: outlast Ukraine through sheer attrition. He's betting that if Russia can hold the line and keep grinding forward, inch by bloody inch, eventually Ukraine or its Western backers will lose the will to continue. It's a grim calculus. Throw men at the problem until something breaks. Russia is currently losing about 30,000 troops every month. In 2023 and 2024, Russia launched several localized offensives. Bakhmut, Avdiivka, that gained little territory but cost tens of thousands of lives. During intensified assaults in summer of 2023, Western officials estimate Russia suffered over 70,000 casualties in just a few months for minimal gains. The Kremlin is sacrificing lives to buy time, hoping Ukraine or the West blinks first. But this strategy carries massive risks. Russia's current casualty rate might be politically sustainable under tight censorship and repression, but it's hollowing out the nation's future. Over 800,000 Russians have left the country since 2022, fleeing conscription or repression. This brain drain will harm Russia's economy and demographics for years. If Putin is forced to mobilize even more reserves, public backlash could grow. The first partial mobilization in 2022 triggered protests and mass immigration. Essentially, Putin is burning human capital to buy time, a tactic that historically leads to collapse if no victory is achieved. And morale is cracking. We've already seen mass surrenders in Kursk. The Wagner mercenary mutiny in June 2023 exposed deep rifts in military command. Yevgeny Prigozhin's private army marched toward Moscow, shooting down Russian aircraft along the way. The mutiny was aborted, but Prigozhin's subsequent death in a suspicious plane crash alienated many hardliners. Discipline is now often maintained by fear. There are reports of barrier troops reintroduced, units positioned behind the front line to shoot anyone retreating. Such measures indicate morale is very poor. Meanwhile, Putin is betting on Western fatigue. But so far, each Russian escalation has only strengthened Western resolve. NATO sees this war as a defining moment. As of 2025, they appear committed for the long haul. And then there's the economic strain. In 2024, Russia's official budget allocated roughly one-third of all spending to defense, about 10.4 trillion rubles, over $101 billion on the military alone, nearly 8.7% of GDP. However, its military budget exceeded the planned $101 billion and was closer to 13.2 trillion rubles, $129 billion. For 2025, Putin boosted the military budget to a record 13.5 trillion rubles, around $145 billion. Russia is effectively trading economic growth for military output. It's a gamble that might be untenable long-term. Moscow has had to implement price controls and currency interventions to stabilize the ruble. Inflation is rising, budget pressures are mounting, and Putin's nuclear threats? They've been called. He drew red lines against Western aid repeatedly, only to do nothing when they were crossed. The delivery of Patriot batteries in 2023 notably reduced Russian missile success rates. Ukraine's Kursk incursion shattered the myth that Russia's homeland was untouchable. When the West crossed Putin's final red line without triggering nuclear retaliation, his bluff was exposed. Western resolve grew stronger. Putin is trying to win by not losing, clinging to territory and inflicting carnage in hopes Ukraine collapses first. But Ukraine, fighting for survival, has shown remarkable resilience. And here's what really keeps the Kremlin awake at night. Russia's military problems aren't just tactical, they're systemic. Decades of corruption have rotted the armed forces from the inside out. Russia's military budget is massive, but huge chunks of it never reach the soldiers who need it. Instead, it's siphoned off by generals, defense officials, and contractors. Inflated readiness numbers, fake equipment reports, stolen training budgets. Russian commanders would report to Putin that units were fully equipped and combat ready. In reality, soldiers were given rusted rifles and expired rations. The infamous 40-mile convoy that stalled outside Kyiv in early 2022 wasn't stopped by Ukrainian resistance. It ran out of fuel, broke down, and got stuck in mud because Russian logistics were a disaster. No proper tires, no maintenance, no planning. Troops were forced to loot Ukrainian towns for food because their own supply chain had failed. Some units didn't even have winter gear in freezing temperatures. Former Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu oversaw years of corruption and incompetence. Paper maps instead of digital systems. Fake fuel reports. Phantom soldiers on payroll who didn't exist. Their salaries pocketed by officers. Putin was fed lies for years about the state of his military. He believed his own propaganda. When the war started, the illusion collapsed immediately. The Wagner mutiny we mentioned earlier, it was the most dramatic proof. Prigozhin's frustration with corrupt military leadership boiled over into open rebellion. A stunning breakdown that showed the world just how fractured Russia's command structure really was. And it's not getting better. The regular army has now absorbed Wagner remnants and Storm Z penal units made up of convicts. These aren't professional soldiers, they're criminals offered a chance at freedom in exchange for cannon fodder duty. This is the backbone of Russia's 2025 offensive capability. Contrast that with Western allies. Professional training, clear chains of command, independent audits and oversight, equipment that actually works. NATO doesn't have to worry about officers stealing fuel or lying about readiness. Russia? Corruption is baked into the system, and it's killing Russian soldiers faster than Ukrainian bullets. So where does this leave Russia in 2025? Looking at all the evidence, Russia's military in 2025 is severely diminished and increasingly dysfunctional. The second best army in the world has been exposed as a facade. Sure, Russia still has nuclear weapons, but nukes don't win wars. They just prevent others from intervening directly. And Putin's nuclear saber rattling has lost its edge. Each empty threat makes the next one less credible. NATO now understands that Russia's nuclear arsenal is a shield, not a sword. Conventional forces will decide this war, and on that front, Russia is losing. Manpower is stretched thin. Over 250,000 soldiers killed, 700,000 injured. Continuous recruitment can barely keep pace, and the quality of troops is abysmal. Equipment losses are crippling. Roughly half of Russia's pre-war tank fleet is gone. Precision missiles are dwindling. Artillery barrels are worn down. Domestic production can't compensate due to sanctions and inefficiencies. Russia is resorting to obsolete gear and imports from North Korea and Iran. Each month, Russia is materially weaker than the last. Adaptation is lacking. Modern militaries learn and evolve under fire. Russia hasn't. Systemic issues persist. Poor coordination, inflexible command, lack of initiative, reliance on brute force tactics. The conservative military culture and political interference from the Kremlin stifle innovation. Meanwhile, Ukraine, receiving Western training and driven by necessity, has proven far more adaptable. And then there's the long-term damage: economic decline, human capital loss, diplomatic isolation. Russia is running budget deficits to fund the military. Inflation is rising. Living standards are quietly falling. Hundreds of thousands of young, educated Russians have emigrated. Thousands more, including elite paratroopers and Marines, lie dead on Ukrainian soil. These losses will echo for a generation. Russia is becoming more isolated, more backward, more hollowed out. It's trading the future for a futile present war. Putin's 2-week special operation has become a multi-year catastrophe. And there's no way out. A decisive victory is out of reach. Ukraine, backed by NATO, continues to fight. The best Putin can hope for is a frozen conflict he can spin as a win. But even that requires avoiding collapse in the meantime. Many analysts predict that by late 2025 or 2026, Russia's combat effectiveness could degrade sharply as losses reach irrecoverable levels. The Russian army may reach a point where it can no longer conduct large-scale attacks, only defend what it holds. And here's the ultimate irony. This war was supposed to make NATO fear Russia. Instead, it's done the opposite. NATO has seen Russia's weaknesses up close: the incompetence, the corruption, the outdated equipment. Western observers now understand that Russia is not the near-peer threat they thought. It's a declining power with nukes, dangerous but far from invincible. Russia's military reputation is permanently tarnished. It has shown itself unable to defeat a smaller neighbor despite unlimited brutality. This is how empires die, not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding collapse. Broadcast live for the world to see. So here's the brutal truth. Russia's military entered this war as the supposed second best in the world. It's leaving it as a cautionary tale of corruption, delusion, and catastrophic failure. Tanks destroyed by the thousands, planes grounded or shot down, ships sunk, soldiers slaughtered in pointless meat grinder assaults. And for what? A nation that's weaker, poorer, and more isolated than when it started. Putin gambled that Ukraine would fold in 2 weeks. Instead, he's exposed his military as a fraud and condemned Russia to years of decline. The question now isn't whether Russia can win, it's how long Russia can avoid total military collapse. What do you think? Can the Kremlin sustain this war of attrition, or is the breaking point coming sooner than Putin wants to admit? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to stay ahead of the biggest geopolitical stories shaping our world, hit that subscribe button, because the fall of empires doesn't happen quietly. And we'll be here to cover every brutal moment.
For years, Russia told the world it was back, that it was untouchable, that the West was in decline, and Moscow was rising. Now, its economy is bleeding, its soldiers are dying, and its empire is dying the same slow death as every fallen power before it. Because history has a script, and Russia is reading it line by line. Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union, all fell in 7 stages. Russia has reached stage 6, the final stop before collapse. War, debt, demographic decay, global isolation. Every warning light is flashing red. And yet, the Kremlin still insists everything is under control, just like the Soviets did, right before they vanished. So today, we're walking you through the collapse stage by stage as it happens in real time. Not theory, not prediction, but the unraveling of a superpower that still thinks it's winning. This is the terminal phase of Russia's illusion. And the fall is already underway. Think about this for a moment. Right now, as you watch this video, Russia is throwing everything it has at survival. Over 100,000 Russian soldiers have died this year alone. The budget deficit is exploding. Spending surged 29% in early 2025 compared to last year. Interest rates hit 21%, the highest in 25 years. And yet, nothing is working. The bleeding won't stop. This is what historians call a terminal spiral, when an empire's attempts to save itself only accelerate its destruction. And here's what makes this terrifying. Putin knows. He has to know, because every dying empire reaches this exact moment when denial becomes the only strategy left. The meetings in the Kremlin must be surreal now. Generals explaining why another 1,000 men died for nothing. Economic ministers pretending inflation is manageable while prices double. Demographic experts showing charts that look like cliff edges. And Putin sitting at his absurdly long table, pretending he doesn't see the empire dying in real time. Every dictator reaches this moment. Stalin died denying the doctor's plot he invented. Hitler spent his last days moving imaginary armies on a map. And now Putin, architect of Russia's destruction, conducting an orchestra that's already fled the building. But before we show you how this ends, we need to rewind. Because Russia didn't arrive at stage 6 overnight. It followed a pattern so predictable, so mathematically precise, that we can track it step by step. Every single empire dies the same way. Rome took 4 centuries to collapse. The British Empire took about 70 years. The Soviet Union? Just 7. And they all followed the exact same playbook. 7 stages, 7 steps from glory to rubble, overextension, currency debasement, debt spiral, productive collapse, social decay, international irrelevance, and finally, the fall itself. The Spanish Empire was the first global superpower. At its peak, it controlled territory on every inhabited continent. Its currency was the world's reserve. Its military was considered invincible. Sound familiar? By 1640, Spain had checked every box. Endless wars in Europe drained the treasury. They debased their currency by mixing copper into silver coins. They defaulted on loans 4 times. Their productive economy collapsed as they relied entirely on gold from the Americas. Birth rates plummeted, and when the gold ran out, the empire that ruled the world for 2 centuries was suddenly nothing. Britain's collapse was more graceful but followed the same pattern. 2 world wars broke them financially. The pound lost its reserve status. Colonies broke away. By 1956, when the Suez Crisis exposed their weakness, the empire that once ruled a quarter of the planet couldn't even control a canal. But the most relevant example? The Soviet Union. Because what's happening to Russia now is almost a carbon copy of what happened to the USSR in the 1980s. The patterns are so exact, it's almost mathematical. Economic overheating followed by sudden cooling. Military victories that become Pyrrhic defeats. Allies who suddenly discover other priorities. Even the rhetoric is identical. The desperate appeals to patriotism, the blame on foreign enemies, the promises that victory is just months away. If you showed these patterns to any historian without telling them the country, they'd say the same thing. This empire has maybe 5 years left, probably less. And just like today's Russia, the Soviets insisted everything was fine, right until the moment it wasn't. Let's start with stage 1, because Russia's collapse began the moment Putin convinced himself he could rebuild the Soviet Empire. February 24, 2022, the day Russia signed its own death warrant. Putin promised a 3-day special military operation. He got a 3-year meat grinder instead. Russia has now suffered over 1 million casualties, killed and wounded in Ukraine. Think about that number. 1 million sons, fathers, husbands gone or broken forever. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Military spending now consumes roughly 7 to 8% of Russia's GDP, double what America spends, triple what most NATO countries spend. In 2025, Russia plans to allocate 40% of its entire federal budget to defense and security spending. Imagine that, nearly half of every tax ruble going to fund a war that was supposed to last 3 days. And here's what's truly insane. They're losing. In all of 2024, Russian forces seized just 4,168 square kilometers, less than 1% of Ukraine. They're paying in blood for every meter, and they're running out of both. According to Medusa, the true death toll is estimated between 200,000 and 220,000 Russians killed. Not wounded, not missing, dead, gone forever. More than America lost in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined in just 3 years. These aren't just statistics. These are entire generations being erased. Entire villages in Siberia and the Caucasus have lost their prime-age males to the front. Wives without husbands, children without fathers, communities without futures. And for what? A few abandoned Ukrainian villages and fields? Territory that's been so thoroughly destroyed it's worthless? This is what overextension looks like in real time. An empire bleeding itself dry for gains so small they're barely visible on a map. But the real cost isn't measured in kilometers. It's measured in what comes next. Because when empires overextend militarily, they always turn to the same solution. They debase their currency. They print money. They destroy the very foundation of their economy. Which brings us to stage 2 and the ruble's death spiral. Remember when $1 US bought 75 rubles? That was early 2022. Today, over 110 rubles. That's a collapse of about 47%, but that's not even the real problem. The real problem is that Russians have stopped believing in their own currency. The money supply has doubled since 2021, from 62 trillion rubles to 118 trillion in February 2025. They're literally printing money to pay for the war, and everyone knows what that means. Inflation is officially at 9%. Walk into any Moscow grocery store and you'll see the real number. Butter prices doubled, meat prices through the roof. Core inflation hit 9.7% annualized in October 2024, and that's with the government desperately trying to hide the real numbers. The central bank solution? Raise interest rates to 21%, the highest since the 1990s collapse. But here's the dirty secret. It's not working. because you can't fight wartime inflation with monetary policy, not when the government is the one flooding the economy with printed money. By 2023, the Chinese yuan had replaced the US dollar as the most traded currency on the Moscow exchange. Think about that. Russians trust China's currency more than their own. They're literally abandoning the ruble for foreign money, the ultimate vote of no confidence. And why wouldn't they? The ruble is toilet paper dressed up as money. Everyone knows it. The government knows it. They just can't admit it. Because admitting it would mean acknowledging what comes next, the debt spiral that no empire survives, which is exactly what's happening right now. Stage 3 is when the bills come due, and Russia's bills are astronomical. Russia recorded a budget deficit of 3.49 trillion rubles in 2024. That's after revenues jumped 26%. They're making more money than ever, spending even more, and still can't balance the books. But here's where it gets truly desperate. The government spent more on debt repayment and interest than it raised from new borrowing. They're literally going backward, paying more to service old debt than they can borrow in new money. The liquid portion of the National Wealth Fund, Russia's rainy day money, stands at just $31 billion. That's it. That's all they have left after burning through hundreds of billions. At the current burn rate, they'll be completely broke within 2 years. And they can't borrow internationally. Cut off from global markets, trapped with 21% interest rates at home, they're stuck in a vice that's only tightening. The budget deficit for 2024 exceeded projections by more than double. They planned for 1.6 trillion rubles. They got 3.3 trillion. And 2025, the deficit is projected to remain above 1.5% of GDP indefinitely. Indefinitely. That's government speak for, we have no idea how to fix this. The math is simple and terrifying. War spending up, tax revenues flat, borrowing costs exploding, reserves nearly gone. You know what comes next, don't you? When governments can't borrow and can't tax, they have one option left, one that the Soviets tried, one that Weimar Germany tried, one that Venezuela tried. They print until the money becomes worthless and the economy becomes a corpse. Which leads us directly to stage 4, the death of Russia's actual economy. Here's what's really happening inside Russia. The economy is being hollowed out like a carved pumpkin. Industrial output growth fell to near zero in February 2025. Investment is collapsing. A 0.5% decline in investment is expected in 2026. The private sector has essentially stopped spending on anything except survival. But the real catastrophe? The exodus. About 650,000 Russians emigrated in 2022-2023 following the invasion, primarily young professionals in tech, science, and business. The very people Russia needed to build a modern economy. They're gone, and they're not coming back. Over 1,500 foreign companies have left Russia since 2022. Toyota, Volkswagen, Microsoft, Apple, the entire Western corporate world pulled out. And what replaced them? Chinese knockoffs and domestic substitutes that don't work. Russia can't even produce commercial airliners anymore. They're cannibalizing their existing fleet for parts. Weapons production is running at zero profit margins, sometimes negative. The vaunted military-industrial complex is basically a money incinerator. By the end of 2024, Russian companies were short 2.2 million workers. Almost 70% of businesses reported severe labor shortages. You can't run an economy when everyone's either dead, fled, or fighting. And here's the sickest irony. The only thing keeping Russia's economy moving is the war. Military production, soldier salaries, death payments to families. That's the economy now. They've created a war-driven GDP that looks like growth, but is actually decay. The Center for Macroeconomic Analysis admits private sector investment has virtually stopped growing. Companies aren't building factories. They're not developing technology. They're not training workers. They're just trying to survive until what? Until the war ends? Until sanctions lift? Until the economy magically recovers? It won't, because this isn't a recession you recover from. It's economic death by 1,000 cuts, and Russia is already bleeding from 999. What happens when the war ends? Or worse, what happens when they can't sustain it anymore? The productive economy is already gone. What's left is a zombie animated by military spending and nothing else. And zombies, as we all know, eventually stop walking. But economies can survive a lot. They can survive debt, inflation, even production collapse. What they can't survive is when the people themselves give up. Welcome to Stage 5, where societies don't just decline, they disintegrate. In 2024, Russia recorded just 1.222 million births, the lowest since 1999. The first quarter of 2025 saw fewer than 294,000 births, the lowest quarterly figure in 225 years. Let that sink in. The lowest in 225 years. Not since Napoleon invaded has Russia seen birth rates this catastrophic. The natural population decline in 2024 was 596,200 people. Deaths exceeded births by over 500,000. The total fertility rate is just 1.41 children per woman, far below the 2.1 needed for replacement. But it's not just about babies, it's about hope, or rather the complete absence of it. In some regions, deaths outnumber births by 3 to 1. Entire regions are becoming graveyards. Over 18% of Russians are now senior citizens, a record high. By 2050, nearly a quarter of the population will be elderly. Who's going to work? Who's going to fight? Who's going to pay the pensions? Nobody, because they were never born. And those who were born are leaving or dying. Hundreds of thousands more wounded, many disabled for life. The young are gone. The middle-aged are exhausted. The old are forgotten. This is demographic collapse in real time. Russia has started classifying demographic data, hiding the true scale of the catastrophe. When governments start hiding population statistics, you know the situation is beyond salvation. Putin even created a demographic special forces unit to boost birth rates. Special forces for making babies. If it wasn't so pathetic, it would be funny. But here's the thing about demographic collapse. It's irreversible. You can't suddenly create 20-year-olds. You can't resurrect the dead. You can't force women to have children in a country with no future. The population pyramid isn't a pyramid anymore. It's a coffin. Wide at the top, narrow at the bottom, and getting narrower every day. Societies can recover from war. They can recover from economic crisis. They can't recover when there's no one left to recover. Which brings us to stage 6. The stage Russia has reached, the point where the world simply stops caring whether you exist or not. This is where we are now. Today, November 2025, Russia has become irrelevant. Remember when Europe depended on Russian gas? Russia's share of EU pipeline gas imports plummeted from over 40% in 2021 to about 11% in 2024. Europe weaned itself off Russian energy in less than 3 years. Russian oil now trades at massive discounts, $56 to $57 per barrel versus global prices. The petrostate that once held Europe hostage with energy is now begging China and India to buy its oil at bargain basement prices. Even traditional allies are walking away. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan refuse to endorse the war. Armenia is publicly broken with Moscow. Nobody wants the ruble. Nobody trusts it. $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves remain frozen by sanctions. Their money is literally being held hostage and they can't do anything about it. But here's the real indicator of irrelevance. The G7 doesn't include them. The G20 barely tolerates them. International forums happen without them. They've become a Chinese gas station, a junior partner selling resources at discount prices to the only country still willing to deal with them. China's two-way trade with Russia hit a record $240 billion in 2023, but it's not a partnership, it's dependency. Russia wanted to be feared, then they wanted to be respected. Now they'd settle for being relevant. But they're not. They're a nuclear-armed relic with a dying population and a collapsing economy, desperately fighting a war they can't win with money they don't have. The world has moved on. Europe found new energy. NATO got stronger. Ukraine became a hero. And Russia? Russia became a memory of what happens when empires refuse to accept reality. This is stage 6, the irrelevance before extinction. The moment when everyone realizes you're already gone, you just haven't stopped moving yet. But stage 7, that's when the movement stops. Here's what keeps Putin awake at night. Not NATO, not sanctions, not even losing in Ukraine. It's the sound of history repeating itself. Because he knows what stage 7 looks like. He watched it happen in 1991. The Soviet Union didn't explode, it simply stopped existing. One day it was there, the next day it wasn't. And the signs are already here. Regional governors are hoarding resources, ignoring Moscow's demands. Ethnic Russians now make up only 70% of the population and falling. Republics like Chechnya and Tatarstan are watching, waiting, calculating when to make their move. The economic triggers are all in place. If oil prices drop significantly or sanctions tighten further, Russia faces an economic implosion it can't survive. No reserves to cushion the fall, no borrowing capacity, no printing press solution that doesn't lead to hyperinflation. What does collapse look like? It's not dramatic, it's pathetic. Government salaries stop being paid, pensions disappear, police stop showing up for work, regions stop sending taxes to Moscow. The military, what's left of it, starts choosing sides. Maybe it starts in the Far East, where Moscow's control has always been weakest. Maybe in the Caucasus, where ethnic tensions simmer. Maybe in Kaliningrad, cut off from the mainland and surrounded by NATO. Or maybe it starts in Moscow itself, a palace coup, a military mutiny, another Wagner-style march that doesn't stop this time. Russian analysts themselves warn the country faces bankruptcy in the medium term. The economy is on a spinning top that will fall if it slows down. But here's the truly terrifying part. Russia has nuclear weapons, thousands of them. What happens to those weapons when the state that controls them ceases to exist? Who gets them? Who sells them? Who uses them? The Soviet collapse was messy but peaceful. This one might not be, because Putin, unlike Gorbachev, won't go quietly. He'll burn it all down rather than admit defeat. The man who started a war to prevent NATO expansion has caused the largest NATO expansion in history. The man who invaded Ukraine to rebuild the empire has accelerated its final collapse. History doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And right now, it's rhyming with 1991, 1917, 1610, every time Russia has torn itself apart. The only question isn't if Russia collapses, it's how violent the collapse will be, and whether the rest of the world survives it. Stage 6 isn't ahead of Russia, it's under its feet. The mistakes have already been made, the empire already hollowed, the illusion already shattered. Economic growth has fallen to 1% and dropping. Birth rates at 200-year lows, hundreds of thousands of soldiers lost, budget deficits exceeding anything sustainable. The Kremlin knows it. That's why they're hiding statistics, classifying demographic data, and pretending everything's under control. That's why Putin talks about nuclear weapons more than victory. That's why Russian state TV has stopped promising to take Kiev and started threatening nuclear apocalypse. They know what we know, what history has always known. Empires die in stages. Russia has reached the terminal stage. Now comes the denial. Then comes the fall. Russia isn't collapsing, it's already collapsed. The only thing left is the crash. When it comes, not if, but when, remember that you watched it happen. Stage by stage, mistake by mistake, lie by lie. The empire that claimed it was eternal proved it was exactly like all the others. Already gone, just too proud to admit it. So what do you think? Is Russia headed for peaceful dissolution like the Soviet Union, or something far worse? And more importantly, who's going to be there to pick up the pieces? Let us know in the comments, because history is being written right now, and we're all watching it happen in real time.